Fate. I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. Published by Web Novel. Promise transmigrated to the Type Moon world and became one of the students of Waver Velvet at the Clock Tower. But a dream must eventually come to an end. Upon waking from a night's sleep, he recalled his identity as a transmigrator and also discovered his golden finger. A heroic spirit class card. It can take Promise to different eras, and by leaving behind corresponding legends, he can ascend to the throne of heroes. He thus traveled to ancient Greek mythology and Norse mythology. Promise. I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. What are you waiting for? Come on, kill me. P.S. This book is not a traditional simulator story. Its content mainly revolves around the Age of Gods, hence the Age of Gods is a long narrative. I didn't use Type Moon in the title cause it was already too large. Yup, this is a translation, cause why not? The credit goes to the original author. It's just fate, and so, if the original author is reading this and wants me to remove it, then please leave a review below. Link, https://trxs.cc/tomgren/8889.html. Join my Patreon to read 30 chapters advance. Patreon.com/obby28. Hera's doting. Good morning, beautiful and wise goddess Athena. Near a small creek not far from the kingdom. The immaculate and elegant goddess sat on a rock by the creek, the rising sun highlighting her waist-length silver hair. Her golden eyes, smiling, looked at the boy who approached her. Hearing his greeting, she nodded gently. As Promise dismounted and approached, she pulled out another golden apple from somewhere and placed it in his hand. Goddess Athena, may I ask you a question? Of course. Whether it was because she found Promise's playful banter with Jason amusing, or because she was excited about him finally embarking on his journey, the goddess who loved heroes and their stories seemed to be in a very good mood. Goddess Athena, why do you always give me a golden apple every time we meet? Promise asked, holding up the apple with a puzzled look. You don't like it? Athena tilted her head. It's not that I don't like it. Although Promise knew these Greek gods could be capricious, often giving benefits for no reason and becoming inexplicably angry in many stories, this was the wise goddess Athena. From their interactions, Promise felt her rationality clearly outweighed her impulsiveness. There's no special reason, I just want you to grow stronger, Athena said with a light laugh, pinching his cheek. After all, compared to that Jason, you seem like a gust of wind could blow you over. I'm not that weak, am I? Promise was a little unconvinced. Although it was true, the other party was Jason. Do you want me to try blowing you over? Well, to fulfill the promise with you, the wise Athena, I also think I should eat a couple more golden apples. Promise said earnestly, carefully storing the golden apple right in front of Athena. The later just found it amusing and didn't say much. Do you know why I chose this moment to see you? Athena then asked Promise. Promise thought for a moment, his gaze inadvertently glancing at Athena's reflection in the creek. Sitting on the rock, her long dress revealed her white, slender legs. You mentioned you would witness me becoming a hero and eventually grant me a grand ending. Promise replied, and I'm still far from being a hero, so if I'm not mistaken, you're here to help me become one, right? Athena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took out another golden apple, but this time, she placed it directly in his mouth. As Promise bit into the golden apple, he thought about something else. Everyone knew golden apples were for restoring strength, and in Greek mythology, they belonged to Hera. Golden apples first appeared at the wedding of Zeus and Hera. Gaia, the earth goddess, brought a golden tree from the edge of the world, gifting it to Zeus and Hera. The tree bore golden apples. Eventually, this golden apple tree was placed by Hera at the edge of the world, in a sacred garden guarded by 3 goddesses and a fearsome creature, the 100-headed dragon Ladon. Many stories in Greek mythology revolve around golden apples. One of Heracles' 12 labors involved retrieving a golden apple from this sacred garden. Another famous story involves the golden apple inscribed, to the fairest, and the 3 golden apples used by Atalanta in her race. That's right. Athena confirmed, not at all embarrassed to have her intentions revealed. Instead, she was quite pleased as she answered, I am here to help you become a hero. Athena loved heroes. If Promise could see her stats, he was sure there would be a hero creation skill, and it would be at least X level. After all, most Greek heroes were associated with her. Her frequent involvement earned her the title of Mother of Heroes, leading some to speculate she was preparing to overthrow Zeus. In this world, only 2 beings had the power to overthrow Zeus. One was Typhon, the progenitor of all monsters. The other was Athena herself. Hey, if Athena really planned to overthrow Zeus, should I help? Wait, to die immortal fighting against the king of gods, Zeus, in such a grand endeavor. Ah, beautiful goddess Athena, I would gladly join your cause. What are you thinking about? Athena suddenly knocked on Promise's head. Goddess Athena, you're peeking into my thoughts. Promise instinctively held his head, looking at her wide-eyed. I didn't peek, but I did tell you that even if I don't know exactly what you're thinking, I can sense it when you're thinking about me. But your thoughts just now were quite bold, not an insult, but... As she spoke, she rested her hand on her chin, looking at Promise with great interest. Actually, it's really nothing. By the way, goddess, do you have any divine instructions for me? Promise changed the topic, asking Athena. Hearing this, the smiled and didn't pursue the previous conversation. A hero aspiring to die gloriously, and Athena, who loves fostering heroes, were indeed a match made in heaven, so to speak. Unfortunately, she was a virgin goddess. From their last interaction, he realized that even the wise goddess had a terrifying potential to become a yandere. Athena then reached into Promise's luggage, pulling out his list of grudges and names. She opened it and skimmed through it. Who do you plan to find first? Heracles. Promise's answer was immediate and without hesitation. After all, when talking about Greek mythology, aside from the Argonauts, Heracles' 12 labors were the most famous. Oh, and there was also the Trojan War. These stories were the hallmarks of Greek mythology. Now that Promise had already embarked on one hallmark, he was certainly eager for another. But to his surprise, Athena shook her head and said, no, you can't go yet. Promise didn't question why, just looked at her in confusion. Do you know about the relationship between Heracles and Hera? Promise nodded. Of course he knew. In Hera's villainous career, persecuting Heracles was one of her most typical stories. You really do know. Did Chiron tell you? No, Chiron wouldn't mention such things. How do you know? Promise didn't answer and instead asked her curiously, why can't I go now? Well, not now. Athena smiled, seeing that he had no intention of explaining, she didn't mind. After all, this was the age of Greek gods. Both gods and prophets who could see the future were numerous. Though, those who dared to pry into the affairs of gods and got caught often met tragic ends. Hera may be fond of you, but even with the blessing of the fates, you cannot interfere with Heracles' affairs now, let alone with someone else also watching over him. Athena didn't specify who that someone was. But Promise immediately understood. The king of the gods, Zeus. Zeus had been watching over the future strongman Heracles since his birth. As for others, Athena looked amused as she glanced at the list of grudges, putting it down. She said to Promise, aside from Heracles, although the others aren't a big issue, let's put them aside for now. Because I happen to have a trial that's more suitable for you. It doesn't require great strength. It only needs the wisdom and courage you displayed on the altar when you offered your sacrifice to Hera, and most importantly. Athena smiled gently as she spoke. Legend has it that in ancient Greek mythology, there was a kingdom called Aegina. The people of this kingdom worshipped a river goddess named Aegina. In fact, it wasn't so much worship as it was that Aegina lived among them, being the true ruler of the kingdom. The king was her child. Aegina was the daughter of the old river god Asopus. Her extraordinary beauty and innocent nature brought her the greatest disaster in ancient Greece. Well, she caught the eye of Zeus. One day, when Asopus was away, Zeus transformed into an eagle, abducted Aegina, and when the old river god discovered this and pursued relentlessly, he struck him with a lightning bolt, breaking one of his legs. Zeus took Aegina to Attica, where he established a kingdom and, to show his love, named the kingdom after her. One of the three judges of the underworld, Aeacus, was the son of Aegina and Zeus. Due to Zeus's influence, this kingdom quickly prospered. Even after Zeus lost interest or found a new target to pursue and forgot about the place in the river goddess, Aegina continued to protect it with all her might, seeing it as her second home. Through her efforts, the kingdom of Aegina became the most renowned in the region of Attica. Many people visited, and the kind-hearted river goddess welcomed them all, treating all her subjects as her children. However, this prosperity attracted the attention of Hera. Upon learning of the river goddess Aegina's relationship with Zeus from the king, Hera became furious. In retaliation, she cast a severe curse. Hera brought various disasters and suffocating plagues upon the kingdom. The once flourishing, vibrant kingdom was shrouded in death in just a few days, becoming a hell on earth. And the river goddess Aegina could only look on in despair, unable to do anything. Most importantly, Promise looked at Athena, who was smiling and observing him, feeling a bit puzzled. That is the most important point, and it is also the divine mandate I bestow upon you. Athena smiled and replied, that would be the most noble goddess, Queen Hera's, indulgence. Themis, the goddess of justice. Published by web novel. Fate, I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. Promise transmigrated to the type moon world and became one of the students of Waver Velvet at the clock tower. But a dream must eventually come to an end. Upon waking from a night's sleep, he recalled his identity as a transmigrator and also discovered his golden finger. A heroic spirit class card. It can take Promise to different eras, and by leaving behind corresponding legends, he can ultimately ascend to the throne of heroes. He thus traveled to ancient Greek mythology and Norse mythology. Promise, I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. What are you waiting for? Come on, kill me. P.S. This book is not a traditional simulator story. Its content mainly revolves around the Age of Gods, hence the Age of Gods is a long narrative. I didn't use type moon in the title cause it was already too large. Yup, this is a translation, cause why not? The credit goes to the original author. It's just fate, and so, if the original author is reading this and wants me to remove it, then please leave a review below. Link, https://trxs.cc/tongren/8889.html. Join my Patreon to read 30 chapters advance. Patreon.com/obby28. Half a month later, Promise arrived in Aegina. He had reached the kingdom cursed by Hera. The journey had been uneventful, and without Jason to back him up, HD had been more cautious, avoiding isolated areas and staying away from bandits. Thus, the journey had gone smoothly. In the kingdom, a light rain was falling, washing away the bleakness that pervaded the land, as if hoping to cleanse it of the plague and disasters. The rain was actually the tears of the river goddess Aegina. She resided in the center of the kingdom, in a tall tower, but rather than living there, she was imprisoned. She could only watch helplessly as her children, the kingdom's inhabitants, and the kingdom itself slowly perished under the curse. Promise walked alone through the kingdom, observing the devastation and the suffering of the sick people. He walked for a long time until, at some point, the sky darkened and an old woman holding a lantern blocked his path. The old woman's eyes were covered with a white cloth as she stood before Promise. With a hoarse voice, she asked, I sense the presence of a stranger. Child, where do you come from, and why have you come here? In ancient Greece, who were the most terrifying individuals? Promise could responsibly tell you, the elderly, children, and women. Especially the elderly, because you could never be sure if the old person suddenly stopping you was a disguised god. However, Promise looked curiously at the old woman blocking his path. After thinking for a moment, he decided to answer, I come from the kingdom of Iolcos. A goddess guided me here. A goddess? The old woman asked calmly, and Promise already had an answer in his mind. This woman was undoubtedly another god. Having met 3 gods already, Promise was getting better at identifying them. However, he was still a bit puzzled, unsure if Athena knew about this or if she had deliberately sent him here because she knew. Wise Athena, the goddess of wisdom, Promise answered straightforwardly, having a good idea of the woman's identity. The old woman was silent for a moment before continuing, why did she send you here? To help the people of this kingdom and lift the curse. Do you know who placed the curse on this kingdom? Yes, Promise nodded, the noble Queen Hera. He naturally knew. Not to mention that during the half-month journey, he had already gathered information about the kingdom of Aegina. In fact, when Athena mentioned Aegina, Promise had recalled the tragic story of this goddess. After all, before using the spirit class card, he had prepared well, studying various myths. Knowing that, why did you come here? The old woman asked with her hoarse voice. A follower of Queen Hera. I already answered that question. Promise smiled, saying, to help the people of this kingdom and lift the curse. Perhaps because Promise's answer was too relaxed, the old woman fell silent for a moment. But likely remembering that this was Athena's arrangement, she soon accepted it. She didn't say anything more and turned to leave. Promise watched her leave, hesitating whether to follow, but she suddenly stopped in front of him. Seeing this, he understood and followed her. They arrived at a small mud house where the old woman lit a lamp and took out a scale from somewhere, placing it on the table. After signaling for Promise to sit down, she took out some fruits and placed them in front of him. Aren't you afraid that by doing this, you might anger the Queen Hera? She asked. Promise took one of the fruits but did not eat it, and replied, no, I'm not afraid. As soon as he finished speaking, the scale on the table tipped slightly. Promise blinked at the sight. Oh, the old woman's voice now held a hint of interest as she asked, is it because you were her follower and she dotes on you? Promise looked at the goddess who had maintained her old woman's appearance despite being detected and shook his head, saying, no. The scale remained tipped, not returning to its original state, and he also realized that it was measuring truth and lies. In ancient Greece, there were not many gods associated with scales, and the most famous one was. Wait, blindfolded eyes and holding scales. In an instant, Promise's eyes widened. The fruit he had been about to bite into stopped midair. He put it down honestly, his body instantly tensing. If that's not the reason, then why aren't you afraid? The woman's voice, now clear and cold, showed curiosity, even shedding the hoarse tone. The reason I'm not afraid is that I already have a plan. The scale wavered slightly. Promise was telling the truth but not the whole truth. After all, he couldn't just say it was because he wasn't afraid of dying. Oh, you have a way to lift the curse? The old woman asked, clearly interested. Promise shook his head and then nodded. Seeing her waiting, he continued, I don't have a way to lift the curse, to be precise. Even if there were a way, I couldn't do it. Because it's a curse from the queen, even if it can be lifted, it shouldn't be. The only one who can lift it is herself. She nodded and then continued, as expected of a child favored by Athena. I've heard about you from her, and I know what happened between you and Hera. But I didn't expect Athena to send you here. Moreover, she suddenly fell silent. After a while, she spoke again and asked Promise a very strange question. What kind of goddess do you think Hera is? What kind of goddess? Noble. The scale wavered again, and she remained silent, standing quietly in front of Promise. I think she should be a gentle and kind goddess. Even my teacher Chiron said so. Promise thought for a moment and answered. Hearing this, she seemed to smile slightly. In the next second, in the flickering light of the cabin, she shed her disguise, her graceful figure clad in a white robe, sitting before Promise. She, out of a moment's anger, has dragged so many lives into this. Seeing this, do you still think she is a gentle and kind goddess? With her clear voice falling, Promise, looking at the now unmasked goddess in front of him and could only show a wry smile, raising his hand as he said, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question, esteemed goddess of justice, Themis. Does Hera know? She doesn't. Published by web novel. Fate, I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. Promise transmigrated to the type moon world and became one of the students of Waver Velvet at the clock tower. But a dream must eventually come to an end. Upon waking from a night's sleep, he recalled his identity as a transmigrator and also discovered his golden finger. A heroic spirit class card. It can take Promise to different eras, and by leaving behind corresponding legends, he can ultimately ascend to the throne of heroes. He thus traveled to ancient Greek mythology and Norse mythology. Promise, I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes? What are you waiting for? Come on, kill me. P.S. This book is not a traditional simulator story. Its content mainly revolves around the Age of Gods, hence the Age of Gods is a long narrative. I didn't use Type Moon in the title cause it was already too large. Yup, this is a translation, cause why not? The credit goes to the original author. It's just fate, and so, if the original author is reading this and wants me to remove it, then please leave a review below. Link, https://trxs.cc/tongren/8889.html. Join my Patreon to read 30 chapters advance. Patreon.com/obby28. The Goddess of Justice, Themis. She does not belong to the 12 Olympian gods but holds an extremely noble position among the gods, second only to Queen Hera and King Zeus. Because she is the creator and guardian of order. She often appears in the world in a white robe, holding a scale in her left hand and a sword in her right, listening meticulously and making indisputable judgments. The white cloth over her eyes does not mean Themis cannot see. Rather, when the day came that all humans and gods needed someone to stand up, she chose to cover her eyes with the cloth. This signifies that she will never be swayed and will always make the most just judgment. Therefore, Themis seldom smiles. To be precise, even the gods do not remember whether she has ever smiled in the long years. Representing absolute justice, she is always meticulous and impartial. Only the beauty mark at the corner of her mouth adds a touch of allure to her otherwise unfeeling demeanor. Thus, at this moment, if the gods, even Athena were here, they would certainly be very surprised. Because in this small mud hut, by the dim lamplight at the night table, she revealed her true face in front of Promise, clearly showing a faint smile. One last question. The cold, emotionless voice sounded again. Themis quietly looked at the boy in front of her. Though her eyes were covered by a white cloth, so she could not see the boy's appearance. Yet, just as the goddess of fate, Clotho, who governs the future, cannot see the present but can see the future. Themis, though unable to see, can see much more. What kind of thoughts brought you here, standing in front of a god? What kind of thoughts? Promise was slightly stunned. Wealth, glory, life. Themis said coldly, what makes you, understanding that this matter could anger the gods and might even lead to your death by their hands, choose to stand before that goddess? And that goddess is the Queen Hera whom you believe in. As Themis finished speaking, Promise did not notice that the scale on the table was shaking even more. Unbeknownst to him, the scale had been gently swaying all along, never stopping. Promise instinctively believed it was judging whether he was lying, forgetting one thing, lies are inherently useless against the gods. Even though Athena had tied a strand of her silver hair around his wrist, it merely prevented the gods from peeking into his heart. Except for Athena herself. And this was the scale of Themis, the goddess of justice, the symbol of absolute fairness and justice, measuring all things in the world. To become a hero, for glory, Promise instinctively answered. Themis did not comment on this response. She just waited quietly, and the lightly swaying scale did not settle. Looking at it, Promise fell silent for a moment. Finally, he hesitantly raised his head, looking at Themis, and after a moment of uncertainty, he answered, I didn't even think about this question. The goddess of wisdom had pointed him in the direction, telling him that this was a path to becoming a hero and spreading his reputation, so Promise came here. Halfway through, when he realized what the matter truly was, Promise's thoughts were only about how to get Hera to willingly lift the curse, nothing more. For this answer, the previously swaying scale finally settled. Themis smiled again, although the smile was fleeting. She stood up, raised the scale in her left hand, and under Promise's puzzled gaze, she turned and left, leaving only one final statement, then go save this kingdom, and I will witness your trial. With that, Themis, holding the scale, pushed open the door and disappeared into the night. Late at night, Promise walked out of the room. To be honest, Promise couldn't quite understand Themis or what she was thinking, but after giving it some thought, he realized it wasn't necessary to understand. His goal was clear, to get Hera to lift the curse on this kingdom. Even if he had gained a special audience, and that audience was a goddess, it wouldn't change anything. It might even add an extra note to the legend on his heroic spirit class card. Extra points. So Promise decisively chose not to dwell on it. Let the gods do whatever they want. After all, she was a goddess of justice, not some unpredictable figure. Feeling relaxed, he took advantage of the night and headed to the tower where the goddess Aegina resided. Everyone in the kingdom knew their goddess Aegina lived in that tower, but there were no guards around. Because the tower was surrounded by a deadly plague, manifesting as a green gas, constantly wielding the scythe like the Grim Reaper. The gas seemed intelligent, attacking any living being that approached. But because of this, when Promise approached, the gas parted, making way for him. After all, he carried the ore left by a goddess, Hera. Thus, in a place where everyone else was stopped, Promise easily walked in and followed the lit lamps up the tower. About half an hour later, he reached the top of the tower. The only room at the top had its door open. The dimly lit room was illuminated by lamps, and the moonlight shone through the window, highlighting the goddess sitting quietly by the window, gazing outside in a daze. She was the river goddess Aegina, who had been captured by Zeus in the form of an eagle. She wore a light blue gown like a layer of thin gauze, with blue hair cascading over her shoulders. Her once beautiful and gentle eyes were now clouded with sadness. She did not cry and seemed very calm about Promise's arrival. Only the rain outside the window had not stopped until now. Did Hera send you? Aegina did not turn her head. Her voice did not carry the resentment or anger that Promise had initially expected but was incredibly flat. There was no emotion in it. Goddess Aegina, it is an honor to meet you. Promise offered a slight bow, acknowledging he was a follower of Hera. The latter did not respond to his words, continuing to quietly look out the window. I have come here hoping to help you lift the curse, Promise said. When he said this, Aegina finally turned her head slightly to look at him. And in that brief moment of eye contact, Promise realized that this once beautiful goddess had now become an empty shell, devoid of a soul. Aegina only glanced at Promise before looking back out the window. Although she did not know who Promise was, she understood from the strong mark hair left that she was extremely fond of this young man. Thus, she did not care about Promise's words, assuming he was here to humiliate her on behalf of his goddess, Hera. In the past, she might have been angry and driven Promise away. But now, she only wanted to sit quietly and wait for everything to end. Seeing this, Promise bowed to her once more and left. And in the end, the goddess didn't give him another look. Promise left the tower. When he stepped outside, the night had not lifted, but the kingdom, shrouded in gloom, could not see the brilliant night sky. He walked out of the kingdom. The calamities and miasma within the kingdom automatically avoided him as if death itself feared him. He left the kingdom and walked for a long time, changing location several times. Until the night goddess Nyx and the sun god Helios exchanged their duties, and it was afternoon. Promise finally sat down on a high hill. He lowered his head, overlooking the small town below, shrouded in gloom. Taking out his canvas and paintbrush from his luggage, he stared at the town below for a long time, yet he did not start painting. He even maintained that posture, sitting there for an entire day and night. What is he doing? Asked the always observant goddess of justice, Themis. Painting, Athena, who stood beside her, replied. They stood just behind Promise, not hiding their presence at all. However, he did not notice them, or more accurately, he did not pay attention, as they were not concealing themselves. Look, Athena said proudly, taking out the gift Promise had given her and showing it off to Themis. The latter remained silent. She remembered this painting, which was prominently displayed in Athena's temple. It was placed right at the entrance. Just as Hera proudly informed the gods that Promise was recognized by the goddess of fate, Athena also showcased this unique offering to the gods. The painting had captured a divine essence, and being the work of a child, it even piqued the interest of Apollo, the god of light, who praised and inquired about it. However, she remained tight-lipped, simply telling them to ask Chiron. Chiron, naturally, knew who it was, but he was wise enough to understand the implications when Athena kept silent. As a good teacher, he certainly wouldn't jeopardize his student. So, in the end, he simply hid, refusing to see anyone. This situation sparked a strong interest among the gods of Olympus. And now, Themis knew. Did he paint it? Yes, Athena nodded and explained, it was his first offering to the gods, and yes, it's mine. As she spoke proudly raised her head. But if Promise knew, he would definitely be dumbfounded. After all, this painting was less of an offering to Athena and more of something she forcibly took at the time, although it was also because of this painting that Athena left that vow. Hera doesn't know? No, she doesn't. Themis understood why Athena had kept silent about it. Recently, Hera had been constantly talking about Promise, neglecting even Zeus's matters. Everyone knew she had taken such a follower and could see how much she valued and cherished this child. At this time, if Athena were to say that the child's first offering was not to Hera but to her, Athena, Hera would probably have the urge to kill her. Especially since she was extremely prideful and had a very strong sense of jealousy. Are you planning to compete with Hera? Themis couldn't help but ask again, curious about Athena's current attitude towards Promise and the fact that she even specifically let him meet herself to ensure that even if something went wrong, as the goddess of justice, Themis could intervene. No, but, actually, there was one more thing the goddess of fate didn't tell Hera. Athena's lips curled into a smile. That child can not only bring glory to her, Hera, but also to me. At this moment, if it were other gods, such as Hermes, the messenger of the gods, or Apollo, the god of light, they would certainly find it amusing. They would rush back to Olympus to spread the news, eager to see if Hera and Athena would fight over this matter. But Themis wouldn't do that. Although she would find it interesting, that was all. So, he plans to paint this kingdom of Aegina and offer it to Hera, and that will make Hera willingly lift the curse. Half right, Athena said with a smile, looking at Promise's back. But don't worry, this matter is basically settled because he has fully understood the meaning of my oracle, Hera's indulgence. Promise sat motionless for another day, finally looking at the blank canvas in front of him and sighing helplessly. Ever since Athena took the painting that day and Promise realized that his paintings could leave a recorded legend, he had been eager to paint for all the 12 Olympian gods. However, they all became blank files, next time for sure. Since that day, Promise found that he could never recapture the feeling he had then. Despite all his efforts to think, focus, and even force himself like he did today, inspiration is elusive. When it doesn't come, it truly doesn't come. It might never come again in his lifetime. So now, helplessly, Promise could only try his best to muster up his energy, dip the brush in water, and paint the kingdom of Aegina on the pristine canvas. By the third morning, when he finally finished the painting, he staggered up, taking the painting back to the kingdom. On the way, he opened his package, looked at the 2 golden apples for a moment, but ultimately did not eat them. He returned to Aegina and handed the painting to the goddess. When Aegina, who had given up on everything and was quietly waiting for the end, glanced at the painting Promise handed over, she was stunned and quickly snatched it. In the painting, she saw the familiar kingdom. It was her happiest moment every day when the dawn broke the night and shone on the land. She would open her eyes and see its bustling beauty. Since she was captured by Zeus in the form of an eagle and left here, she had poured all her efforts into creating this kingdom. This tower was not initially built for imprisonment. It was created so that Aegina could see the most beautiful scenery in her heart every morning when she woke up. So she stared at the painting, until a tear fell on the painting, wetting it. She woke up in a panic, hurriedly wiping her face and carefully trying to dry the wet corner of the painting. The more she wiped, the more anxious she became, and the tears wouldn't stop falling on the painting. But as a result, the incessant rain finally ceased, and after a long time, bright sunshine once again illuminated the city. Beautiful. Athena, hiding in the clouds with Themis, clapped her hands in delight. Now the second painting isn't Hera's either. Themis glanced at the happy Athena beside her, feeling that if she had to judge between them, there was no doubt that Hera would win. Is it delightful? Very delightful. Tilde. Published by Web Novel. Fate. I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. Promise transmigrated to the type moon world and became one of the students of Waver Velvet at the Clock Tower. But a dream must eventually come to an end. Upon waking from a night's sleep, he recalled his identity as a transmigrator and also discovered his golden finger. A heroic spirit class card. It can take Promise to different eras, and by leaving behind corresponding legends, he can ultimately ascend to the throne of heroes. He thus traveled to ancient Greek mythology and Norse mythology. Promise. I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. What are you waiting for? Come on, kill me. P.S. This book is not a traditional simulator story. Its content mainly revolves around the Age of Gods, hence the Age of Gods is a long narrative. I didn't use Type Moon in the title cause it was already too large. Yup, this is a translation, cause why not? The credit goes to the original author. It's just fate, and so, if the original author is reading this and wants me to remove it, then please leave a review below. Link, https://trxs.cc/tongren/8889.html. Join my Patreon to read 30 chapters advance. Patreon.com/obby28. Aegina cried for a long time. And at the moment she cried, Promise left. He sat outside the room of the tower, waiting for Aegina to regain her composure, but he never expected to fall asleep leaning against the wall. Having not rested for nearly 3 days, and having worked at the highest intensity on the painting, Promise now felt as exhausted as he had when he first started training under Chiron, not wanting to move a single finger. He didn't know how long he slept, only that when he woke up, he was lying in Aegina's bed inside the room. And Aegina sat quietly beside him, still looking out the window. The only difference was that she clutched the painting tightly in her hands, as if afraid it would disappear the next moment. The afternoon sunlight shone into the room and onto the goddess's frail figure, making her appear like a painting herself, showcasing her helplessness and confusion vividly. Seeing this, Promise still felt a headache but got up from the bed and said, "Thank you, goddess Aegina." The latter still didn't respond to him. When the rain cleared and everything was exposed under the sunlight, Aegina found it easier to see how her cherished kingdom had become so dilapidated. Watching her children suffer under the curse. So even though Promise had poured his heart into delivering to her the most beautiful moment in her heart once more, she still harbored deep-seated aversion towards the boy, feeling the heavy presence of Hera's influence on him. Goddess Aegina, may I ask if you can now listen to my request? Aegina didn't answer immediately, and Promise, not in a hurry, waited quietly for a long time before he got a response. Speak. Aegina uttered her first words in a long time, her originally melodious voice now filled with deep exhaustion. Please order your people to build a sacrificial altar for me, Promise said. An altar dedicated to the most noble goddess, Hera. When Promise finished speaking, Aegina turned her head to look at him. Even she, at this moment, looked at Promise with a look of astonishment, doubting what she had heard. And the latter, clearly aware of how outrageous his request was, quickly explained, I intend to offer a tribute to Hera and pray for her blessing. At that moment, as Aegina stared at Promise's determined expression, she finally understood. She finally realized that Promise did not know everything, that he did not know that the one who had caused this calamity and cast the curse was Hera. After all, she had not told her people about Hera's divine punishment. Telling them would only hasten their deaths and further anger Hera, possibly ensuring that her people would not find peace even in death. Even the messenger of the gods, Hermes, would not wisely report such matters immediately. Usually, such events would be widely publicized only after they concluded. With this in mind, Aegina finally understood that this child might indeed have just accidentally learned of the situation here and genuinely wanted to help. Despite some doubts in between, she instinctively considered this the best explanation. Otherwise, she could not fathom why Promise, as Hera's cherished follower, would stand against Hera. Even the goddess of justice, Themis, held doubts and questioned Promise with the scales of judgment. With this thought, Aegina felt jealous that the ugly Hera had such a devoted follower. Then, an idea sprang to her mind. In that instant, Aegina decided to build a sacrificial altar for this boy, placing it not far from her tower. And when the boy offered his tribute and prayed for the goddess's descent, she would walk out of the tower and stand beside him. As a goddess, Aegina naturally did not fear Hera's cursed plague. More so, she wanted to witness Hera's appearance and see her cherished follower praying for her to lift the curse. Aegina thought that at that moment, Hera's expression would be quite spectacular. Thus, she smiled, a smile filled with hidden malice, confusing Promise with its intensity. Very well. She agreed to Promise's request with a voice dripping with hatred. And all of this was observed by Athena and Themis. They sat as spectators, being extremely wise gods themselves, and naturally understood immediately what Aegina was thinking. Aegina intended to spite Hera and use Promise to do it. Even Themis raised an eyebrow at this. Athena didn't bother to hide the disdain and scorn in her eyes but held back Themis from intervening. There's no need, because she hasn't realized that the boy already knows everything but is still trying to help her. So, in the end, she will only reap what she has sown. Themis understood Athena's meaning and stopped. So, Aegina gave the command. Even though her kingdom, which had gathered around her, was already on the verge of collapse, when she gave the order, the people still gathered, dragging their weary bodies to build the altar for the divine offering. Despite their despair, a glimmer of hope appeared on their faces at this moment. Seeing the sky finally clear up and hearing Aegina's decree, they naturally believed that their goddess had finally found a way to save them. They thought that their days of hopelessness were finally coming to an end. And in the future, their goddess would surely guide them again, leading their kingdom back to prosperity. This scene made Aegina, who had calmed down and felt guilty for using a child, reaffirm her resolve. Thus, after a week, as night fell and the goddess of the night, Nyx, hung the stars high in the sky, with the light of the full moon illuminating the land of the divine era in the torchlit night. The cursed people raised their torches high, standing outside the flaming altar, eyes filled with hope as they gazed at the young boy standing before it. The flames illuminated the boy's slightly immature face and his clear emerald green eyes under the night sky. At this moment, Promise was dressed in a light blue ceremonial robe given to him by Aegina, meant for offering sacrifices to the gods. Under the watchful eyes of everyone, he cast the offerings into the altar. To the noble and great queen of Olympus, the kind goddess who governs marriage and childbirth, your loyal follower, Chiron's student, Promise, expresses the highest respect and offers all the precious wealth on my body. With that, Promise threw everything he had into the altar. The wooden bow made by Chiron during his training on the mountain, the money he and Jason had looted, and the items Jason had forcefully given him before he left. And the 2 golden apples he hadn't eaten until now. When he took out the canvas and paintbrush, Promise hesitated a little. After all, the canvas was something Chiron had crafted based on Promise's description, something that didn't exist in this era. The paintbrush was a gift from Chiron to Promise. But after a brief hesitation, he still threw everything in. Although he didn't notice that as soon as he threw them in, they were intercepted by Athena, who was hiding among the stars. Athena took the paintbrush and canvas, watching the ritual below, narrowing her beautiful golden eyes. Because she was so focused on Promise, she didn't notice the slight smile on the usually stern face of the justice goddess, Themis. With her eyes covered by a white cloth, she lost the sight of the physical world but gained the ability to see much more. Unhappiness, anger, and a bit of jealousy. Themis felt it necessary to find some time to remind Hera. After all, she had a pretty good relationship with Hera, even though she also got along well with Athena. But still, she should remind Hera to keep an eye on her followers. After completing all this, Promise continued, I sincerely pled, noble and kind goddess, please respond to your loyal follower. The moment Promise's words fell, almost instantly, the most noble goddess on this land appeared before Promise. Her beautiful golden curls flowed from beneath her crown, her magnificent face veiled in a faint layer of golden light. Hera's amber eyes gazed at the boy before her, the boy who was offering sacrifices to her for the first time and pleading for her presence. She arrived in the shortest possible time, wearing the most splendid divine attire. Offering sacrifices to the gods and pleading for blessings. When Promise learned about Aegina's situation, this was the first solution that came to his mind. And it was not unique. The Caledonian boar. That was the punishment handed down by Artemis, the moon goddess. To deal with this monster, another hero under Chiron's tutelage and a future member of the Argo, Meleager, who was also on Promise's grudge list, did something similar. Informed by the fates, he knew he couldn't seek help from other gods. So, he prepared for a long time, offering numerous sacrifices to Artemis, eventually gaining her forgiveness and permission. Moreover, he received the goddess's blessing. Only then could Meleager organize the Caledonian hunt, inviting many heroes to participate and hunt down the monster. Promise, although unable to offer as much wealth, understood something clearly as a transmigrator. To gods, the amount of the offering didn't matter much. Many things they desired were easy for them to acquire. Therefore, in front of gods, the most important thing was sincerity. Promise offered everything he had. For this, not only Hera but even Athena, faced with such sincerity, would find it hard to refuse Promise's request. Hera's indulgence. Indeed, the divine oracle Athena gave Promise referred to offering sacrifices to Hera, who would surely respond to his plea. But it's called indulgence for a reason. Indulgence means going overboard. Just doing a little to please Hera would suffice, but you had to offer everything, including the 2 golden apples I gave you, and even the paintbrush. Athena was smiling. But the paintbrush in her hand was transforming. Seeing this, Themis covered her mouth with her hand, unable to hide her smile any longer. This meticulous goddess of justice laughed heartily, probably for the first time in hundreds of years. Because this was such blatant dissatisfaction and jealousy. Hey, wise goddess Athena. Most noble and beautiful queen, thank you for answering my plea. Please listen to my wish. Seeing Hera descend, clearly in a good mood, Promise felt relieved. Honestly, he was a bit nervous inside, even though he believed he had done his best. Asking Hera to lift her own curse, especially given that Aegina was her rival, made Promise feel uneasy. Knowing a lot, being a transmigrator, was indeed Promise's advantage. But knowing too much, like the secret rivalry between Hera and Aegina, was why he chose to offer everything. Please, most noble one, remove the curse that has befallen this kingdom. Seeing his sincere plea, and Hera's expression remained serene, her golden eyes gazing deeply into his. When Promise expressed his wish, the goddess Aegina also appeared there. She was dressed in her most elegant attire, ready to mock Hera and revel in Hera's bewildered reaction. But, okay. Hera agreed without a moment of hesitation. In that instant, the rare smile on Aegina's face froze. Even before Promise could react. Hey, Hera, what are you saying? Do you realize where you are and who I am? Aegina stood in front of Hera, brimming with rage. In response, the latter only gave her a fleeting glance and then continued to smile warmly at Promise. Is this your wish, Promise? She asked gently. Yes, Promise nodded, taken aback by Hera's reaction. Hera, you, HMPH, do you even know this, Hera's follower? Aegina, seeing that Hera ignored her, shifted her gaze to Promise with a hint of malicious delight, saying, the disaster and plague that ravaged this kingdom, the divine being who destroyed everything, isn't someone else, it's this goddess you believe can save everything. Your kind goddess, Queen Hera, yes, it was she who destroyed it all. After saying this, Aegina laughed happily. She thought Promise would be in disbelief, causing his faith to waver, and panic in front of Hera. However, Promise looked at Aegina, puzzled. I knew from the beginning. Didn't you ask me at first if it was goddess Hera who sent me? Aegina was stunned, staring at Promise in disbelief. Hera, who had initially been a bit confused, seemed to come out of her joyful daze, looked around, and finally at Aegina. Realizing where she was and who Aegina was, she was also taken aback. Meanwhile, hidden among the stars with Athena, Themis, who had been completely engrossed in the scene, placed a hand under her chin. Coming to her senses, she glanced at Athena. She saw that just a moment ago, Athena, who was filled with jealousy, now had a face full of delight, her lips curling into a smile, looking as if she had finally seen a long-awaited drama unfold. Truly, you are something else, Athena. A trial must be held here. Published by web novel. Fate. I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. Promise transmigrated to the type moon world and became one of the students of Waver Velvet at the Clock Tower. But a dream must eventually come to an end. Upon waking from a night's sleep, he recalled his identity as a transmigrator and also discovered his golden finger. A heroic spirit class card. It can take Promise to different eras, and by leaving behind corresponding legends, he can ultimately ascend to the throne of heroes. He thus traveled to ancient Greek mythology and Norse mythology. Promise. I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. What are you waiting for? Come on, kill me. P.S. This book is not a traditional simulator story. Its content mainly revolves around the Age of Gods, hence the Age of Gods is a long narrative. I didn't use Type Moon in the title cause it was already too large. Yup, this is a translation, cause why not? The credit goes to the original author. It's just fate, and so, if the original author is reading this and wants me to remove it, then please leave a review below. Link, https://trxs.cc/tongren/8889.html. Join my Patreon to read 30 chapters advance. Patreon.com/obby28. Under the cursed kingdom and the sacrificial altar, the gathered people, tormented by the curse, held high their torches, driving away the darkness and illuminating the night. As their revered gods, the river goddess Aegina and the most exalted goddess of this era, Hera, descended together, the people, in their panic, bowed and worshipped, lowering their heads. They couldn't hear the conversation between the three, as Aegina knew these were not words for them to hear. You said you knew from the beginning that this curse was cast by Hera. If that's the case, then why? Aegina, deeply shaken, looked at the black-haired, green-eyed boy before her, illuminated by the flames, and asked in disbelief, why do you still stand before her, your goddess? She was an innocent and kind goddess. Even though she deeply despised Promise because of Hera, when Promise collapsed outside the tower room from exhaustion, she still gently carried him to her bed. Thus, Aegina had mentally prepared herself. When she thought she had used Promise to spite Hera, she had already prepared to be hated by the boy who was willing to help her for the rest of his life. To soothe her guilty conscience, Aegina repeatedly told herself that it was the boy's own choice to side with Hera. Therefore, at this moment, when Promise, in a matter-of-fact tone, said that he knew the curse was cast by Hera, which was why he came here and stood before her, praying for her blessing, Aegina was stunned, disbelieving, and at a loss. She couldn't believe that her so-called preparation was merely wishful thinking. She couldn't believe that the boy before her truly stood before the gods for her in this kingdom. And this god was not only the most exalted goddess of this land but also the goddess that this boy worshipped. At the same time, Hera was equally at a loss. When Aegina asked her question, full of deep turmoil, her amber eyes instinctively turned towards Promise. Having recovered from the joy of receiving Promise's offerings, which included everything he had, she now finally realized where she was and who the goddess glaring at her with hatred was. Because the Hera I know is a kind and gentle goddess, Promise replied. One cannot lie to a god, so what he said was the truth. After all, you said Queen Hera is a kind and gentle goddess. This was Chiron's response to Promise's question during his studies. Moreover, this description was clearly recorded in the legends. Did Hera not know that what she did, casting a curse and taking away innocent lives, leading a once prosperous kingdom to ruin, was wrong? She knew, of course. But as the goddess of marriage, a staunch defender of monogamy, who could not have a fulfilling marriage herself, she became pathologically bitter, hating everyone who tainted her marriage. Thus, while Hera knew, she didn't care. She just wanted to destroy anyone who tainted her marriage, to ruin everything Aegina cherished. But because she actually knew, when Hera heard Promise say this and saw this faithful believer trusting her, a strange feeling surged in her heart. And she couldn't help but turn her head away. At that moment, she was even grateful that she wore a veil tonight. Kind and gentle goddess, Hera, you, what virtue or ability do you have for such praise? Aegina laughed bitterly, her voice filled with mockery and resentment. Usually, if Aegina, a mere river goddess and her rival, dared to be so disrespectful, Hera would have punished her harshly. But today, Hera didn't. She didn't even glance at Aegina, her eyes fixed only on Promise. Child, you have offered me everything you have, and all you ask is for a blessing. A blessing for this kingdom that has nothing to do with you. Turning her veiled face away, Hera asked Promise. No, it is not unrelated to me, noble and kind Queen Hera, Promise replied with words he had prepared long ago. Because I know you are a kind goddess, I cannot ignore the calamity before me. After all, I am your believer, noble goddess. Therefore, high and exalted queen, please hear my wish again. I ask you to grant your blessing to this kingdom, so that the world will know your name and your greatness. Aegina fell silent. Even though she hated Hera deeply, at that moment, she too felt a surge of hope. Hearing Promise's wish, Hera turned her head even further away. At that moment, Hera finally understood the feelings she had just experienced. They were the joy of being trusted by this boy and the shame of betraying his trust. For the most exalted goddess of Olympus, Queen Hera, to feel ashamed, it could only be said that Promise was indeed worthy of the wisdom goddess Athena's prophecy. Hera's indulgence. It's over. At the same time, the goddess of wisdom, Athena, who had been witnessing everything from the best seat in the house, couldn't help but reveal a satisfied expression. As the spectator in the best seat, she had witnessed this drama unfold on stage, from its beginning, filled with all kinds of dramatic developments, to its climax. Given her understanding of Hera, Athena knew Hera couldn't refuse Promise's wish at this moment. She also knew that Hera would definitely flee immediately after agreeing and wouldn't show up in front of Promise for a long time. So, just as she was about to get up from the audience, step onto the stage to replace Hera and Aegina, and bring this performance to a close. Athena, do you know why I have been standing here all this time? The voice of the goddess of justice, Themis, sounded beside her, asking Athena with a cold tone. Athena, who was about to move, instinctively turned to look at Themis when she heard the question. And she froze. Because she saw Themis. No, at that moment, she saw the goddess of justice and judgment. Unnoticed, Themis had raised the scales of judgment in her left hand and the sword of judgment in her right hand. Athena knew Themis was there, naturally drawn by the injustice happening in this kingdom. And Themis was also her safeguard for Promise. If something went wrong, her presence would be enough to make Hera stop. Because when that child came before me, I raised the scales and measured him. Are you not afraid of angering the exalted queen because of this? And why did you come here to stand before her? Watching Themis, Athena widened her eyes. Because she finally saw this meticulous goddess show a rare smile due to Promise's arrival. And, oh wise goddess, do you know what I was measuring? Without waiting for Athena's response, Themis took a step forward and stepped onto the stage. Just as Hera nodded and was about to agree to Promise's wish, then turn around and flee, as Athena had predicted. Wearing a white robe, with eyes covered by a white cloth, holding the scales of judgment in her left hand and the sword of judgment in her right, the goddess of judgment appeared before everyone. Then, she raised the scales in her hand. In the silence of all, her cold and undeniable voice announced, "Here, there must be a trial." As soon as these words were spoken, Themis' power enveloped everything present. Promise only felt a dazzling white light coming, which made him close his eyes subconsciously. At this moment, Athena was surprised by this completely unexpected development, but she finally understood. The climax of this stage has finally arrived. He will judge the great god. Published by web novel. Fate. I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. Promise transmigrated to the type moon world and became one of the students of Waver Velvet at the clock tower. But a dream must eventually come to an end. Upon waking from a night's sleep, he recalled his identity as a transmigrator and also discovered his golden finger. A heroic spirit class card. It can take Promise to different eras, and by leaving behind corresponding legends, he can ultimately ascend to the throne of heroes. He thus traveled to ancient Greek mythology and Norse mythology. Promise. I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. What are you waiting for? Come on, kill me. P.S. This book is not a traditional simulator story. Its content mainly revolves around the Age of Gods, hence the Age of Gods is a long narrative. I didn't use Type Moon in the title cause it was already too large. Yup, this is a translation, cause why not? The credit goes to the original author. It's just fate, and so, if the original author is reading this and wants me to remove it, then please leave a review below. Link, https://trxs.cc/tongren/8889.html. Join my Patreon to read 30 chapters advance. Patreon.com/obby28. There should be a trial at this moment. In ancient Greek mythology, Themis, the creator and protector of order and goddess of justice, came to the world holding the scales of judgment in her hands. She covered her eyes with a white cloth, representing justice that would never be blinded, and announcing the coming of judgment. Promise's eyes were covered by white light, making him close his eyes subconsciously. However, when he opened them again, he found that the original kingdom had disappeared from his sight, the night and the stars had also disappeared, and instead, a pure white court had appeared. The courtroom was filled with confused spectators. They were the people of the river goddess Aegina, who were cursed and ravaged. And in the audience, there were two people, or to be more precise, two goddesses standing opposite each other. They were naturally the queen of Olympus Hera and the river goddess Aegina. Both of them had confusion written all over their faces, but it was not the first time Hera had seen such a scene, so she quickly focused her gaze to the side. Goddess Themis, dressed in a white robe, was meticulously holding up the scales of judgment. Just as Hera frowned and was about to ask. The judge ones are Hera, the queen of Olympus, and Aegina, the river goddess. Judge, student of the centaur sage Chiron, Promise. Themis, the goddess of justice, once again issued a horrifying declaration. Huh? The person who immediately exclaimed was Athena, who was standing next to Themis with an incredible look on her face. Obviously, even the goddess of wisdom was shocked at this moment. Then, without waiting for everyone to react, the scales of judgment in Themis' hand began to shake gently, and the next moment Hera and Aegina came to the court and to be judged. Promise, with a confused look on his face, put on the white robe that he presented the judge, sat on the highest position of judgment, and looked at the queen and goddess below. He was stunned for a while, then immediately fixed his eyes on Athena. His eyes were full of confusion and questions. My wise goddess, what are you doing? Athena was stunned, and some black lines appeared on her forehead. Hey, what does that look on your face that says I'm the culprit mean? The eye contact between this man and the goddess had not yet ended, when Themis, Hera shouted with an extremely ugly face. Even though she was wearing a veil, it couldn't hide her anger at the moment. What are you doing? As Hera's voice fell, a dazzling bolt of lightning struck down with a loud bang, shocking the people in the audience who were also making a fuss because of the sudden change. Hera's amber eyes stared at Themis angrily. There was a gleam of thunder in her eyes. She was Hera, the queen of heaven, the most noble goddess on this continent. This was because of the unbreakable oath Zeus made to her when he proposed to her in order to win her. Hera shared the power and honor of the god king Zeus. Among them, it represents the power that only the king of gods Zeus controls, thunder. Are you trying to judge me? Judge me, Queen Hera? Hera questioned Themis harshly. Yes, Themis was indeed an extremely special deity, the creator and guardian of order, a goddess of absolute justice who was revered and respected by all gods. But there are always people with privileges in this world, and gods are no exception. The ruler of this era is Zeus, who built the Olympus temple. Thus there were only two people. Themis did not have the power to judge. They were the queen and the king of gods. After all, the order she created also needed to rely on the Olympus god court. This was why Hera is so angry at the moment. But in fact, under normal circumstances, she would not be so angry. After all, she has always had a good relationship with Themis in private. One should know that even the laws of marriage and the concept of family were actually created by Themis, who gave them to Hera to restrain the king of gods Zeus. The reason why Hera was so furious now was mainly because of the sacrifice that had just taken place. Moreover, apart from the king and queen of the gods, even Hades, the god of the underworld, and Poseidon, the god of the sea, although they might feel the same displeasure and anger, they must endure until Themis' judgment is concluded when the verdict is truly upon them. No one has the ability to directly overturn the table like Hera at this moment. Facing Hera's questioning and her anger, Themis was very calm. It should be said that under normal circumstances, no other expression would appear on her face. Hera, you are wrong. I am not the one who judges you. I have already said. As she said this, Themis turned around and walked up the steps at a steady pace, step by step, to Promise, who was sitting at the highest point of the court and watching the play. Placing the scales of judgment on the table of promises. The one judging you and Aegina is Chiron's student, your follower, Promise. As she spoke softly, she bent down and whispered in Promise's ear. Child, in the future, avoid interacting too much with Athena. Learning what from whom? Learning from that goddess who loves drama. Hey, Athena shouted directly, what are you saying? I can hear you. Wait a moment. Hera frowned, shifting her gaze from Themis to Athena, and asked in confusion, Athena, why are you here? This, hey? The latter covered her lips with her hand and revealed an elegant, perfectly standard goddess smile. Then, without waiting for Hera to continue asking, she climbed the stairs in 3 or 2 steps and came to the other side of Promise. On the other side, Themis, who gave the scales to Promise, now placed the sword of judgment in her hand on the ground and stood beside him. Goddess Athena, this. Then, just when Promise was confused and was about to ask Athena. Judge, Promise. She interrupted him with a smile. Her golden eyes stared at everything in the pure white court before her. As one of the representatives of absolute wisdom, Athena naturally saw through Themis' plan. That's right, Themis couldn't judge Hera. But right now, at this moment, and in this matter. Although he had already given Hera his all, but by some strange coincidence Promise had such qualifications. The evidence was that although Hera's face was full of displeasure, the thunder in her eyes disappeared at this moment, and she actually chose to stand in front of the scales of judgment. Promise was speechless and winked at Athena. No way, my wise goddess, are you sure this is a wise decision? Athena didn't answer. She spread her hands innocently to him and gestured to Themis beside him, who had actually made the decision. Then she turned around and ran to the audience seats, sitting down with a sense of entitlement, eagerly awaiting the upcoming judgment. Promise was dumbfounded. No, are they really doing this? Thinking this, he couldn't help but cast his gaze at Hera. Instinctively, he thought that the proud Hera would definitely refuse. After all, this was an insult to her as the queen of the gods. But, let the trial begin. Taking a deep breath, Hera finally raised her head and met his gaze. At this moment, her eyes were incredibly gentle, and the smile beneath the veil was equally soft. My child, my beloved follower, today you have offered me your everything, and all that you have done for me until now, your trust in me, I have always seen it and never forgotten it. Therefore, at this moment, I, Hera, the queen of the gods, am willing to give you this unprecedented favor and honor. As Hera's voice fell, it spread in the silent, pure white courtroom. At this moment, even the river god Aegina, who already hated Hera to the bone, was completely stunned, looking at her with an expression as if he had just met her today. As for the audience, they were completely and utterly shocked. What did we see? A trial, and not just any trial, but one created by the goddess of justice, Themis, herself. And the ones being judged are the world's most noble goddess, Hera, the queen of the gods, and their revered deity, the river god Aegina. However, that's not the main point. The real focus is that the one conducting the trial, seated in the supreme judgment seat, is not the goddess of justice, Themis, but a child, a boy. This boy will, under their witness, judge the great gods. Promise, you have brought shame to the goddess of fate. Published by web novel. Fate, I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. Promise transmigrated to the type moon world and became one of the students of Waver Velvet at the Clock Tower. But a dream must eventually come to an end. Upon waking from a night's sleep, he recalled his identity as a transmigrator and also discovered his golden finger. A heroic spirit class card. It can take Promise to different eras, and by leaving behind corresponding legends, he can ultimately ascend to the throne of heroes. He thus traveled to ancient Greek mythology and Norse mythology. Promise, I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. What are you waiting for? Come on, kill me. P.S. This book is not a traditional simulator story. Its content mainly revolves around the Age of Gods, hence the Age of Gods is a long narrative. I didn't use Type Moon in the title cause it was already too large. Yup, this is a translation, cause why not? The credit goes to the original author, it's just fate, and so, if the original author is reading this and wants me to remove it, then please leave a review below. Link, https://trxs.cc/tongren/8889.html. Join my Patreon to read 30 chapters advance. Patreon.com/obby28. So, are they really doing this? The joys and sorrows of people are different. Feeling inexplicably bewildered, Promise did not pay attention to the noisy, shocked people beside him. Instead, after glancing at Hera, the river goddess Aegina, and Themis standing next to him with the sword of judgment, he instinctively turned his gaze to Athena. But seeing the goddess's eyes full of excitement and glee, he understood that the Athena he had already labeled as the joyful demon and trash goddess was utterly unreliable now. So, unable to understand, he simply stopped thinking about it. After all, Hera's words just reminded Promise. This was an unprecedented honor. In this courtroom, gathered by the powers of the goddess of justice, Themis, he will now exercise the powers of this goddess of justice to judge the gods. Even if he ultimately fails, this event will be recorded as a brilliant chapter in history. So, what's the price? The price was nothing more than being resented by these fickle goddesses, being punished, and eventually dying. But in return, it will be a legend that will be passed down through the ages, engraved on the heroic spirit rank card, enhancing the quality of the heroic spirit, and allowing him to ascend to the throne of heroes. Therefore, although he didn't understand what was going on, once Promise realized that this was a profitable and highly rewarding situation, he instantly became calm. Forget it, who cares what these goddesses are thinking, let the trial begin. And just as Promise made up his mind, the scene. At the moment Promise made up his mind, Themis's lips couldn't help but curve slightly. Her eyes, covered with white cloth yet able to see more, now saw Promise's determination, although she didn't know what exactly he had decided. So, Themis directly spoke, her voice cold and devoid of any emotion. Queen Hera, in a fit of anger, you cast a vicious curse upon this country, causing disasters and plagues to spread, shrouding this kingdom in death, turning it into a living hell. Countless lives perished because of this, correct? The emotionless voice of Themis fell in the courtroom, instantly silencing the previously noisy jurors. It was only now that they realized who had cast the curse that destroyed their world. Upon hearing this, Hera did not react much. As mentioned before, although she knew in her heart that what she did was wrong, she didn't actually care. Because when faced with the river goddess Aegina, who had an affair with Zeus, the only way to quell her anger was to destroy everything Aegina cherished, to fill her beloved country with the stench of death, turning it into a living hell. Only this could calm Hera's rage. She had always treated all her rivals, those who had affairs with Zeus, in this manner. And as time went on, her punishments became increasingly severe, which was why she often appeared as a villain in Greek mythology. So, if it were usual times, Hera wouldn't even bother to answer such questions. However, because it was Promise sitting in the ultimate judgment seat, she explained, that was because she shamelessly seduced someone else's husband first. I did not. Aegina gritted her teeth and loudly defended herself. Upon hearing their statements, the previously quiet audience in the observation seats couldn't help but start discussing again. Obviously, through such dialogues, these people roughly understood what had happened between these two goddesses. Themis, however, showed no reaction to this. After all, such matters were not unusual among the gods. She didn't continue questioning this issue but instead asked Aegina, daughter of the river god Asopus, Aegina, do you know why you were standing here? Aegina was slightly stunned. Do you know that Promise is a follower of Queen Hera? Themis continued to ask. I know, Aegina nodded, given the mark Hera left on Promise, anyone could see it. Then do you know why he came before you? Upon hearing this, Aegina seemed to understand something, fell silent for a while, then answered, I know, when he first appeared before me, he told me he came to help me and my people, to lift the curse. Since you know this, what did you do to this child who came before you to help you and your people, daring to stand before the god he believed in? Aegina lowered her head, and after a while, finally answered, I used him, and not only that, when I saw how much Hera cared for the child, I immediately thought I had to kill him in front of her. After all, I never thought he could actually make Hera bestow blessings. I just wanted that vile goddess to experience the pain I felt. Upon hearing this, Hera's eyes widened in disbelief as she looked at Aegina. What did you say? And as Aegina confessed everything, she finally felt completely relaxed. She raised her head to look at Hera, even showing a smile on her face, and said, because, Hera, since you destroyed everything of mine, why shouldn't I choose to destroy what you cherish? Even though this child is innocent, and despite the risk of being hated and punished by the god he believes in, he still chose to help you, Themis interjected calmly. Exactly. Aegina raised her head and loudly questioned Themis, he is innocent, but what about my children? They died painfully because of Hera's curse. I watched them die before my eyes. I watched this kingdom slowly perish. Were they not innocent too? Since Hera does not care about any of this, why should I? Huh? So, I almost died? Should I be happy or sad about this? Upon hearing this, Promise didn't know what expression to show. And not just Promise, even Aegina's people in the audience were conflicted, unsure of how to react. Though Promise and they were confused about entirely different things. But Promise soon felt relieved, deciding he should feel happy. After all, he thought of Athena. The more he interacted with the goddess of wisdom, the more he felt that if he died without fulfilling his promise to her, she would indeed go to the underworld to chase after him. But the problem is, she wouldn't be able to find him in the underworld. Then, with heroic spirit summoning, Promise didn't dare to think further. At the same time, he looked at the river goddess Aegina, who had just revealed everything and was laughing freely, and at Hera, who looked angrily at Aegina but couldn't find words to rebut. Promise once again realized that in this ancient Greek era, it wasn't just the virgin goddesses who had problems. It seemed that almost all the goddesses had some serious issues. Just as he thought this, Promise instantly felt several gazes turned towards him. Not to mention the keen Athena, even Themis beside him turned her head. Frightened, Promise quickly stopped thinking and ceased his wild thoughts. Then, silence. Tapping the ground lightly with the sword of judgment in her hand, Themis instantly silenced all the noise in the pure white courtroom. After doing all this, she finally turned to face Promise. And that cold voice seemed a bit softer now. Promise. Everything about this situation is now presented before you, with nothing held back, whether right or wrong. Therefore, now is the moment for your judgment. As Themis's voice fell, the ever-swaying scales of judgment finally stilled, settling into a balanced position without favoring either side. Hera, although angry and frightened by Aegina's words, didn't immediately explode. Instead, she looked towards Promise, who was seated at the highest position. Aegina naturally did the same. However, unlike Hera, she now wore a satisfied smile. The people in the jury, who had also learned everything and were now silenced by Themis, couldn't help but focus their gazes on Promise. Now they knew why Promise had come to their kingdom. They knew that although he was a follower of Hera, he still chose to bring them blessings, standing against his goddess. They also knew that he almost died at the hands of the goddess they revered. With so much information, their minds were now in turmoil. But regardless, they could only do one thing at this moment: wait. Wait for the final judgment. And just then. So, what exactly did you see that day? What did your scales of judgment truly judge about Promise? Athena's voice suddenly whispered in Themis's ear. At this moment, only Themis could hear it. She wasn't surprised by this. In fact, she was slightly taken aback that Athena had only come to her now. Athena smiled. She sat in the most special seat in this pure white courtroom, her silver hair cascading behind her, and her golden eyes quietly observing everything in the court. You chose to intervene in this judgment at the moment it was supposed to end. Your intentions are not hard to guess. Since you came here, you naturally aim to bring absolute justice, especially since this is indeed a good opportunity. Because of Promise, you can make Hera face her actions in the most unique way, and I guess you felt a bit guilty over the years. After all, it was you who created the concept of marriage and family and entrusted it to Hera, hoping it would bind King Zeus, but it ended up binding Hera instead. Themis's expression remained unchanged, and she did not respond. But these reasons alone cannot justify why Promise deserves to sit in that judgment seat. The answer lies on those scales of judgment. Themis, what exactly did you see? When Themis heard these words, a smile finally appeared on her face. And then, she did something that no one had expected. She lightly smiled, reached out, and removed the white cloth covering her eyes. The goddess of justice, Themis, was not blind. The reason she covered her eyes was merely to ensure she made the most impartial judgments without being swayed by what she saw. However, this judgment was not hers. So she removed the cloth, revealing her beautiful eyes, as blue as the sky, and quietly focused on Promise, who was frowning and deep in thought. I asked 2 questions. Then, Themis responded to Athena. First, whether this child is inherently good. The scales of judgment did not give me an answer, but now I naturally know the answer from you, because he is both abandoned and favored by the goddess of fate. Therefore, whether he is just and kind or ugly and evil depends on his future path, his choices. The heroic spirit rank card will lead Promise to different eras, leaving legends and then ascending to the throne of heroes. But in fact, not only heroes can ascend to the throne of heroes. Thus, when I couldn't get a definitive answer, I asked a second question: is his judgment fair? And at this question, the scales of judgment immediately gave me an answer. And it showed me a future scene under his judgment. Themis can also see the future, knowing many things and secrets that even the king of the gods, Zeus, does not. For example, the fate of the son of the sea goddess Thetis, who will be stronger than his father. The sea goddess Thetis is the mother of the great hero Achilles. What did you see? Athena couldn't help but ask. At this moment, under Themis's gaze, Promise, who had finally made up his mind, stood up and looked at Themis. Goddess Themis, may I ask you a question? Of course, Themis gently responded. Because he was preoccupied, Promise didn't even notice that Themis had removed the cloth from her eyes. May I ask, how much power do I hold in this judgment? Can my verdict bring the dead back to life? Everything, as you wish, Themis answered. Thank you. Relieved after getting the answer he wanted, Promise turned to face everyone below and, under their watchful eyes, delivered his judgment. Noble Queen Hera, river god Aegina, my judgment upon you is guilty. Although bold, Promise's judgment did not cause a huge reaction, as everyone had already reached the same conclusion after Themis's questions. Therefore, noble goddess Hera, please heed my judgment. Grant the people of this kingdom a nightmare and bestow upon them a great blessing. A nightmare? Hera looked at Promise in confusion. A nightmare in which their kingdom suffers a curse from a certain god, disasters and plagues fall upon them, they lose everything in the dream. But fortunately, when they wake up, none of it is real. At this point, Promise paused slightly. And that dream will naturally include this very trial. Hera was stunned, and even Athena was taken aback at this moment. Only Themis, who had removed her white cloth, quietly watched Promise. And she smiled softly. As for the river goddess Aegina, my judgment for you is to build a temple. Promise looked at Aegina and said, and that temple must be built by your own hands, with you praying there every day for at least 100 years. And the god of that temple will be none other than Queen Hera. When Promise's judgment ended, there was no sound at all. Everyone was clearly taken aback, staring in disbelief at him, who had just made such a judgment. You knew all of this from the beginning, which is why you forcibly intervened and descended upon this trial at that moment. Athena couldn't help but ask Themis. Themis smiled softly, not immediately answering Athena. Instead, she said, that child lives up to the prophecy of the goddess of fate. He is the one who can bring glory to both you and Hera. Hera's punishment is to rebuild everything she sought to destroy and to witness it flourish. The punishment for the river goddess Aegina, stemming from her malice towards Promise, is to kneel before the Hera she despises, before the goddess whom Promise worships, and pray to her. But these are just the surface, Athena responded. When the nightmare ends, for the blessings bestowed by Hera, everyone will praise Hera's greatness and forget the past disasters. Although Aegina prays to the one she hates most, she will also regain everything she lost. Her prayers will prevent Hera from acting against her, and how can Hera accept all of this calmly? That's right, this is the future I saw, Themis gently nodded, answering. The kingdom that was heading towards destruction will return to prosperity. And in the temple that Aegina built for her devout prayers, Hera will choose to hide behind the pillars, unable to face her. Athena's face revealed a look of realization. She finally understood why this meticulous goddess of justice only smiled when she saw Promise. And this was precisely the outcome that the scales of judgment had shown Themis. This may not be an absolutely just verdict, but even I would choose to praise such a result. Promise's judgment ended, and after a long silence, Themis's voice broke the stillness as she put the white cloth back over her eyes. However, your true reason for placing him in the judgment seat isn't just that, is it? At this moment, Athena, having seen through everything, narrowed her eyes at her. I should have seen it from the start, the gaze beneath your white cloth always quietly watching Promise. I think the prophecy of the goddess of fate will be rewritten once again. To this, Themis did not respond. She simply allowed the corners of her mouth to lift slightly in a faint smile. At this moment, in the temple of the goddess of fate, threads of fate spread throughout the temple, and within this magnificent temple knelt Clotho, the goddess of fate who controls the future. She held a crystal ball in her hands, and within the ball appeared the image of a young boy with black hair and clear emerald green eyes. The threads of fate emanating from the crystal ball connected to both Queen Hera and the goddess of wisdom, Athena, corresponding to the prophecy Clotho had once given. But now, unable to witness the present yet able to see the future, Clotho gazed at the newly emerged threads of fate intertwining with those of the goddess of justice. She remained silent for a long time. After a while, Chiron's student, Promise, you. She gently stood up, cradling the crystal ball that contained Promise's fate, and walked through the temple woven with threads of fate, heading towards the exit. And at the same time, her somewhat youthful and soft voice slowly said, "You have brought shame upon the goddess of fate because of you." The Dream Awakens, Goddess Aegina. Published by Web Novel. Fate, I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. Promise transmigrated to the type moon world and became one of the students of Waver Velvet at the clock tower. But a dream must eventually come to an end. Upon waking from a night's sleep, he recalled his identity as a transmigrator and also discovered his golden finger. A heroic spirit class card. It can take Promise to different eras, and by leaving behind corresponding legends, he can ultimately ascend to the throne of heroes. He thus traveled to ancient Greek mythology and Norse mythology. Promise, I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. What are you waiting for? Come on, kill me. P.S. This book is not a traditional simulator story. Its content mainly revolves around the Age of Gods, hence the Age of Gods is a long narrative. I didn't use type moon in the title cause it was already too large. Yup, this is a translation, cause why not? The credit goes to the original author. It's just fate, and so, if the original author is reading this and wants me to remove it, then please leave a review below. Link, https://trxs.cc/tongren/8889.html. Join my Patreon to read 30 chapters advance. Patreon.com/obby28. As the pure white courtroom dispersed, the original night was replaced by dawn. The light that dispelled the darkness shone upon the scarred kingdom, and also on the goddess of justice, Themis, who was dressed in white and had her eyes covered with a white cloth. And she held a young boy in her arms. At this moment, the boy had already shed the white robe representing judgment in the courtroom, changed into the ceremonial attire he had worn the previous night, and was unconscious in the goddess's embrace. Athena, who was watching from the side, was not surprised. After all, even though Themis was by his side, neither the power of the judgment scales nor the authority of the verdict was something a child could bear. Not to mention this child, who was so fragile that every time Athena saw him, she couldn't help but want to shove a golden apple into his mouth, fearing that one day a gust of wind would blow him into the underworld. And at the moment they left the courtroom, all the jury members who had witnessed this special trial had already fallen into a deep sleep. The power of the judgment had enveloped this kingdom, sealing everything within it, including time itself. The birds flying in the sky were frozen mid-flight like statues, the dew falling from the trees and the leaves drifting in the air were similarly suspended. This kingdom had become a special space of stillness. And under its seal, only a few individuals could move within this kingdom at this moment. More precisely, only the four goddesses. And this situation would continue until the verdict in the courtroom was fully executed. This was the power of the goddess of justice, Themis. Themis. She was the daughter of Uranus, the primordial god of the sky, in Greek mythology, and one of the 12 Titan gods of the second divine court. She was born of noble lineage, possessing immense power, and was one of the oldest deities on this continent. When she covered her eyes with the white cloth, she became the creator and guardian of order, respected by all the gods. And because she was the creator and guardian of order, the verdicts in her pure white courtroom were absolute. When Themis wielded the sword of judgment in the pure white courtroom constructed by the scales of judgment, the entire world would respond and execute the results of Themis's judgment. Thus, at that very moment, Hades, the lord of the underworld, raised his head in his temple in the underworld, aware of what had transpired. Although he understood what was happening, Athena couldn't help but snort softly as she watched Themis gently cradling Promise in her arms. With her golden eyes that had witnessed everything, she had already realized. The goddess of justice before her was the third figure prophesied by the goddess of fate, Clotho, the third person whom Promise would bring glory to. In simpler terms, the goddess of justice was essentially here to steal him away. And Athena hadn't even managed to take Promise from her yet. Ignoring Athena's gaze, Themis, once her eyes were covered with the white cloth, was almost impervious to any external influence. She turned around and, with 2 steps, carried Promise to the high tower within the kingdom, gently placing the unconscious boy on the bed of the river goddess Aegina. She also placed the now still scales of judgment beside Promise. Then she turned her head and said to the hastily following river goddess Aegina, "Take good care of him for now. I will be back shortly. Let's go, Athena, Hera." With that, she turned to head to the underworld with Athena and Hera to execute the judgment. What happened to him? Seeing Promise unconscious, Hera, who had finally recovered from the trial, immediately panicked and instinctively asked Athena. That was Themis's judgment. How could a child possibly bear it? Athena explained to Hera, but Themis gave him the scales of judgment from the start, so he was protected by its power. As long as the judgment is completed, he will wake up. Why should I go with you? Athena crossed her arms and looked at Themis. You initiated the judgment, so it should be you and Hera who complete it. I am merely a spectator, and I didn't participate in your judgment. Besides, leaving the child here like this, aren't you worried? Remember, this river goddess initially wanted to kill him, so it would be better if I stayed to guard him. Themis did not respond to Athena's words and stood quietly in front of her. However, the river goddess Aegina quickly became anxious and hastily said, I absolutely won't think of harming this child again. I swear by my name, Aegina. Athena glanced at Aegina and was about to say something when. Aren't you curious, Hera? Themis suddenly spoke, her cold voice devoid of emotion, why this wise goddess is here, and why this child is here as well. Hera was slightly stunned and tilted her head slightly but before she could turn around completely. I'll go. Athena glared fiercely at Themis, then turned and grabbed Hera. Let's go, to the underworld. However, to go to the underworld, they needed a guide, as none of the three had ever been to that eternal dark place. So they sought out the one god among the 12 Olympians familiar with the way, the messenger of the gods, Hermes. When they arrived in the underworld and met its ruler, Hades. In the temple, Hades had been waiting for them for quite some time. Hades was not a god of many words, so before the arriving goddesses could speak. I can grant your request to return those who came to the underworld due to Hera's anger and curse, Hades said directly. But I have one condition. As he spoke, his dark eyes fixed quietly on Hera. Then he told the queen of the gods, the goddess of marriage, his condition. Hera, though somewhat surprised by the condition, eventually agreed. About half a month later. In the high tower, in the room of the river goddess Aegina. The scales of judgment beside Promise, which had remained still, suddenly began to sway gently. With this slight movement, Promise's eyelids fluttered, and he slowly opened his eyes. Sitting up and looking around in confusion, he once again saw the goddess quietly sitting by the window in the high tower. She still wore a light blue dress, her soft blue curls falling over her shoulders, her gaze quietly watching her kingdom outside the window. But this time, Aegina's face no longer showed sorrow or pain. Instead, it was adorned with a genuine smile. Child, you're awake? As she noticed the movement, Aegina turned her head and focused her gaze on Promise. Her eyes, now fixed on Promise, were filled with unprecedented gentleness, deep guilt, and indescribable gratitude. Good morning, goddess Aegina. Promise, seeing the sunlight streaming in through the window onto her, was momentarily unsure of the time of day. But that wasn't the important part. As if recalling something, after greeting her, Promise immediately got out of bed and took 2 steps to the window. Although he had been lying down for more than half a month, thanks to the scales of judgment, he didn't feel any fatigue, as if he had just had a good night's sleep and woke up refreshed. When he reached the window, basking in the bright sunlight, he looked out. Promise saw a prosperous kingdom, teeming with people, and the sounds of their joyful laughter could be heard clearly even from the high tower. The dream, it seems it truly has ended. He smiled and looked at Aegina beside him. Isn't that right, goddess Aegina? Name, Promise. Age, 16. Era, Ancient Greek Age of Gods. Identity, Transmigrator. Heroic Spirit Class, Unconfirmed. Heroic Spirit Legend Event. Met the future king of Athens, Theseus, and together apprenticed under the centaur sage Chiron. Initially mistaken for Jason, but in a nearly desperate situation, single-handedly brought a nearly uncontrollable situation back under control, becoming the person prophesied by the goddess of fate, Clotho, to bring glory to Hera. Now you have received an oracle from the goddess of wisdom, Athena, to come before the river goddess Aegina, who had lost everything due to Hera's curse, and offered her a painting of what she had lost, in exchange for a sacrificial ritual to Queen Hera. Facing Queen Hera, you offered her everything you had, asking only for a blessing in return, and ultimately succeeded. After all, this was the oracle given to you by the goddess of wisdom, Hera's indulgence. But at that moment, the goddess of justice, Themis, arrived, initiating the trial. She revealed all the hidden secrets of the incident to you and invited you to sit in the judgment seat, granting you a special honor alongside Hera. That is, in the pure white courtroom, you, as a mere mortal, judge the gods. It turns out that this goddess of justice had weighed you on the scales of judgment from the very first day she met you, and she saw that future in you. This is not an absolutely just verdict, but it is a judgment that even I, the goddess of justice Themis, would praise. This was a trial that even the goddess of justice, Themis, praised. It is also a trial destined to be etched in history. Even though under your judgment, it all became a dream, and when the dream ends, everyone will forget everything and embrace a better future. But history will record everything. Therefore, heroic spirit quality enhancement. See, fame soars. Fate. I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. Published by web novel. Promise transmigrated to the Type Moon world and became one of the students of Waver Velvet at the Clock Tower. But a dream must eventually come to an end. Upon waking from a night's sleep, he recalled his identity as a transmigrator and also discovered his golden finger. A heroic spirit class card. It can take Promise to different eras, and by leaving behind corresponding legends, he can ultimately ascend to the throne of heroes. He thus traveled to ancient Greek mythology and Norse mythology. Promise. I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. What are you waiting for? Come on, kill me. P.S. This book is not a traditional simulator story. Its content mainly revolves around the Age of Gods, hence the Age of Gods is a long narrative. I didn't use Type Moon in the title cause it was already too large. Yup, this is a translation, cause why not? The credit goes to the original author. It's just fate, and so, if the original author is reading this and wants me to remove it, then please leave a review below. Link, https://trxs.cc/tongren/8889.html. Join my Patreon to read 30 chapters advance. Patreon.com/obby28. Promise, do you want it? In the afternoon. In the heart of the kingdom of Aegina, bathed in bright sunlight, within the high tower where the river goddess Aegina resided. This goddess, who once caught the attention of Zeus due to her beauty and innocent nature, and was ultimately taken by him in the form of an eagle, now sat by the tower window. Not only was she wearing her favorite, beautiful dress, but she had also spent nearly half a day with the nymphs of the kingdom, having them groom her blue curls and tidy her attire. She presented herself in the most elegant and beautiful manner before Promise. And Promise, who was sitting not far from her, was intently observing Aegina and capturing her most beautiful moment, on the canvas before him. Yes, after waking up and witnessing the city's original prosperity and grandeur the next day, he had picked up his paintbrush and canvas, following the oracle left by Athena when she departed, to depict the river goddess Aegina before him. Although Promise was curious about how the paintbrush and canvas, which had been thrown into the sacrificial altar for Queen Hera, ended up in Athena's hands, he was nonetheless happy to reclaim them. After all, if Hera asked about it, he could just blame Athena. But why did Athena leave such an oracle? That's because the next stage belongs to her, of course. Athena's initial oracle set the stage for this entire event. Then, the goddess of justice Themis, the river goddess Aegina, and the finally arrived Queen Hera joined Promise on this stage, delivering an excellent performance of development and climax. During these phases, Athena indeed played the role of a spectator, quietly observing with her golden eyes and not participating directly. But she never intended to remain a mere spectator. She always reserved her entrance for the stage, which is as crucial as the climax, the conclusion. A good ending can make a story memorable and deeply impactful. Moreover, she is the mother of heroes. Athena is called the mother of heroes not because she enjoys watching heroes' adventures, but because she actively shapes heroes. So, she is far from being a mere spectator. She has always been involved in various legends, personally guiding heroes and witnessing their lives. And she made a vow to Promise in her name as the goddess of wisdom. Under the painting that he dedicated to her, Athena's vow was that she would witness Promise becoming one of the brightest stars of this era. And in the end, she would grant him a finale that would astonish the world. It's important to know that for a deity, a vow made in their name is absolute. Promise, you seem to be in a good mood. The river goddess Aegina wore a beautiful smile, her expression gentle as she looked at the boy with black hair and clear green eyes before her. Ah, can you tell, goddess Aegina? Promise, lightly waving his paintbrush, looked at Aegina in surprise. Yes, the latter smiled, her smile growing even warmer, and said softly, after all, you were even humming a tune just now. Ah, sorry, goddess Aegina. No, it's all right. Aegina quickly shook her head and said to him, I'm just very happy. Seeing you so happy makes me really glad. So, child, can you tell me why you were so happy? Well, because I feel like I've done something very meaningful. Promise thought for a moment and replied. It wasn't entirely a lie, but heroic spirit quality C. This journey had just begun, and he had already raised his quality significantly, jumping directly from E rank to C. Although it was C, it was still a significant leap. And how long had it been, even including the half month he was asleep? It had only been at most 2 months since he parted from Jason. Just 2 months. With such a rapid improvement, Promise instantly felt that his future was bright. Moreover, this was the first time his heroic spirit class card, this golden finger, was molding a heroic spirit. If the first time he could reach a rank, no, directly reach S rank or even the grand rank. What kind of future would that be? Promise couldn't even imagine. What a bright future it would be. Ah, praise the goddess of justice, Themis. Thinking about this, the smile on Ho's face became even more pronounced. If his hands weren't occupied with painting, he would have certainly taken out his lyre to play a tune or two. Promise could play the lyre. Do you remember when Jason found Promise at the foot of the mountain? At that time, he was playing the lyre, performing a sorrowful melody. And he had learned his lyre skills from Orpheus. Orpheus, the son of Apollo, the god of light, and a future crew member of the Argo. His most famous story is about entering the underworld for his wife, using his music to move Hades and Persephone, and gaining permission to bring his wife back to the mortal world. The condition was that Orpheus was not allowed to look back on the way back from the underworld. But in the end, Orpheus broke this condition, and just as they were about to reach the mortal world, his wife's cries and anger made him turn back to comfort her. Ultimately, this led to their eternal separation, unable to meet again. Yes, Promise was indeed the last in Chiron's class, with Jason being the second last. But Promise's last place was very different from Jason's. After all, unlike Jason, who didn't want to learn anything, felt a headache at the mention of studying, and always told Chiron, don't teach me, I won't learn even if you do, Promise was quite enthusiastic and willing to learn everything. And the reason was simple. His true self wasn't here, so life and death didn't matter to him. In fact, his greatest goal and wish was to die and ascend to the throne of heroes. So, while studying on Chiron's mountain, he had nothing else to do and could only learn more to see if he could achieve legendary feats. It's like entering a game and seeing something light up, making you want to click on it to see if you can unlock an achievement. With Promise's boundless energy, as in, whenever he had nothing to do, he wanted to go down the mountain seeking death. And since he couldn't subject the fragile Promise, who seemed like he could be blown into the underworld by a gust of wind, to excessive training, Chiron naturally put in a lot of effort in other areas. So, besides surpassing Chiron and even receiving graduation rewards for his painting skills, Promise also learned music from Orpheus, medicine from Asclepius, the god of healing who could revive the dead in the future, hunting skills from Meleager, who would lead the hunt for the Caledonian boar, and so on. not to mention learning swordsmanship from Theseus and archery from Heracles. And because of this, Promise got along well with everyone, well enough that every time they went down the mountain, they had to grab Promise by the neck and bring him to Chiron's doorstep, making sure he was taken care of before they could leave with peace of mind. Otherwise, where do you think Promise's little book of grudges came from? In the end, only Jason was easy to fool, taking him down the mountain. And this was also why Chiron secretly followed them down the mountain and left a protective charm only on Promise. While he believed in teaching without discrimination, having a student who was willing to learn anything and listen to everything was a delight for any teacher. If Promise wasn't so intent on seeking death, he'd be perfect in Chiron's eyes. At this moment, the river goddess Aegina's gaze softened even more at Promise's response. In fact, if it weren't for the gently swaying scales of judgment beside Promise and the uncertainty of when Athena and the others might return, she might have already. Just as Aegina had this thought, the scales of judgment beside Promise swayed more violently, scaring the goddess into halting her thoughts. She lowered her head and dutifully posed as a model, allowing Promise to capture her on the canvas. Promise was painting very seriously. After all, he remembered that one of his legendary achievements was the painting dedicated to Athena. He needed to create portraits for all the gods of Olympus. Unfortunately, right now, they were all empty folders waiting to be filled. Promise also remained keenly aware of the almost enlightening experience he had when he painted Athena. So, faced with a goddess willing to model for him, Promise was giving his utmost effort, hoping to recapture that feeling. In the end, Promise realized he was overthinking it. Inspiration, it seemed, was not something that could be forced. 3 days and nights later. On that evening, as the blue sky was tinged with the hues of dusk by the setting sun. After discarding numerous sketches, Promise finally produced a relatively satisfactory portrait and presented it to Aegina. To be honest, Aegina couldn't see much difference between them. She felt heartbroken seeing Promise discard so many beautiful drawings, each capturing her image perfectly. Each portrait was of her, after all. When Promise finally completed the painting, besides feeling happy, Aegina also felt a bit regretful. After all, during those 3 days, watching him engrossed in his painting was mesmerizing, especially since, during those 3 days, his eyes were only on her. Thinking this, Aegina couldn't help but glance again at the swaying scales of judgment beside him and then lowered her head in disappointment. Goddess Aegina, is my painting not good enough? Seeing her reaction, Promise asked in confusion and a bit of anxiety. Before the flustered river goddess Aegina could respond. It's not that your painting isn't good enough, but that someone has let their most hideous desires surface from deep within. That familiar and elegant voice reached Promise's ears. As he turned his head, a hint of surprise in his eyes as he saw the beautiful goddess of wisdom, Athena, with her silver hair cascading to her waist, and the meticulous goddess of justice, Themis, wearing a white robe and a white cloth over her eyes, with only a beauty mark near her lips adding a touch of allure, returned together. Upon their return, Aegina immediately lowered her head in fright. Athena glanced at her briefly before ignoring her. Aegina did not have the standing to be mocked by Athena. Even though she had dressed herself in her most beautiful attire, standing beside Athena, she didn't even qualify as a mere green leaf. Then Athena smiled slightly and approached Promise. Are you all right? No physical issues? She asked. Yes, I'm fine, goddess Athena, Promise began to say, but his words were cut off as something was shoved into his mouth. Athena had skillfully placed a golden apple into his mouth, hoping he wouldn't be blown into the underworld by a gust of wind. After watching Promise take a couple of bites of the golden apple, Athena finally felt at ease. She then picked up the painting from Aegina's hands, glanced at it, and then turned around, saying, Come with us. As soon as she spoke, Themis collected the scales of judgment, gently patted Promise's head, and led him out of the room. As the trio of goddesses and Promise stepped out of the high tower, Promise felt a brief flicker in his vision and found himself standing by a small river not far from the kingdom. Standing by the river, under a sky adorned with the hues of dusk, Athena, holding the painting in her hand, turned to him and asked, Promise, do you think that your ordinary canvas and paintbrush are truly worthy of capturing the image of a god? Promise was momentarily taken aback by her question. He had never considered this issue. Until now, he had only painted 2 deities, Athena and the river goddess Aegina. In fact, when you paint our images on canvas, we are aware of it. The more accurate your depiction, the stronger our perception of it becomes. To us, it feels as if you were praying while painting, making your presence very clear. Athena had appeared beside Promise back in Jason's hometown because she sensed him drawing her and became interested. Let me tell you something else, Promise. Every depiction you've created of the gods so far has been far from ordinary. With these words, and under Promise's puzzled gaze, Athena smiled and tossed the painting of Aegina into the air. Because, whether it was my painting or Aegina's, you had our permission and recognition before you painted them. Therefore, what you've been painting all along are not mere pictures, but true representations of the gods. As she spoke, the painting that had been tossed into the air began to disappear, turning into faint starlight that scattered. Your canvas can capture our images because we want you to. It represents our gaze upon you. When you truly need it, you can use it to connect with the gods, and we will naturally respond to you through the painting, bestowing our blessings. As Athena's words ended, the painting floating in the sky completely dissipated, turning into a faint starlight and scattering. Therefore, your canvas can capture us because we want you to. It represents our gaze upon you. When you truly need it, you can use it to connect with the gods, and we will naturally respond to you through the painting, bestowing our blessings. As she finished speaking, the painting in the sky had completely vanished. At the same time, Promise felt a mysterious power. Under the influence of that power, he instinctively looked towards the nearby river. In the next moment, the river water, responding to his thoughts, formed a column and rose into the air. The river goddess Aegina, standing nearby, smiled as she watched. Yes, this was her divine power. This was also why Athena had not dared to tell her that the painting she had shown to all the gods was actually drawn by Promise. After all, such a painting was a gift from the gods. Through it, you could not only request blessings from the gods, but in necessary moments, the gods could even descend directly beside you through it. This was a gift only given to a child truly loved by the gods. So if Hera knew that the painting was done by Promise, she would instantly realize something else, that Athena had ulterior motives regarding Promise. But is this the main point? Of course not. When Athena explained all this to Promise, and he felt Aegina's divine power, he instantly understood one thing. This was undoubtedly the noble phantasm he had been searching for. A special noble phantasm that belonged only to him. And at the moment Promise realized this, his breath nearly stopped. But losing a beautiful painting with each use is too extravagant. Moreover, because your canvas is too ordinary, even if we infuse it with divine power, the painting will gradually fade over time. Therefore, Athena turned her head and blinked at the dazed Promise. The corners of her mouth curled into a smile that looked like that of a devil. No, it was the most beautiful, graceful smile of a goddess. With the most melodious voice, she said to Promise, do you want it? Do you want a canvas that can permanently preserve the divine images of us gods, and a paintbrush that can perfectly depict us on that canvas? My dear little Promise, do you want it? Fate, I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. Published by Web Novel. Promise transmigrated to the type moon world and became one of the students of Waver Velvet at the Clock Tower. But a dream must eventually come to an end. Upon waking from a night's sleep, he recalled his identity as a transmigrator and also discovered his golden finger. A heroic spirit class card. It can take Promise to different eras, and by leaving behind corresponding legends, he can ultimately ascend to the throne of heroes. He thus traveled to ancient Greek mythology and Norse mythology. Promise, I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. What are you waiting for? Come on, kill me. P.S. This book is not a traditional simulator story. Its content mainly revolves around the Age of Gods, hence the Age of Gods is a long narrative. I didn't use type moon in the title cause it was already too large. Yup, this is a translation, cause why not? The credit goes to the original author. It's just fate, and so, if the original author is reading this and wants me to remove it, then please leave a review below. Link, https://trxs.cc/tongren/8889.html. Join my Patreon to read 30 chapters advance. Patreon.com/obby28. Is it too wasteful? Praise the wise goddess Athena. If Promise still had the wooden bow he had when he first ascended the mountain, rather than having sacrificed it to Queen Hera that night, he wouldn't have hesitated to break it by the river's edge in this sunset to pledge his loyalty to the goddess before him. But before he could fully revel in his joy. Even if you want it, for now, it's just a dream. Athena still wore that divine, no, demonic smile that teased his heart as she spread her hands and continued, because I cannot create such a divine tool. There is only one God who can. Hearing this, Promise, slightly taken aback, instantly realized and said, the god of craftsmanship. Hephaestus? Hephaestus, the god of craftsmanship. He is one of the 12 Olympian gods, the son of Zeus and Hera. When Promise mentioned Hephaestus's name, Athena wasn't surprised. After all, Promise was a student of the centaur sage Chiron, and Hephaestus was renowned even among mortals. She continued smiling, the corners of her mouth lifting even higher as she said to Promise, yes, it is Hephaestus. Only he can forge a paintbrush and canvas I mentioned, which can truly bear the images of his gods. And fortunately, although he has a temper as volatile as a constantly erupting volcano, he usually responds to the requests of children. But Promise, you are not among them. Why? Confused, Promise asked instinctively, as he had never had any interaction with the god of craftsmanship and didn't believe he had done anything to offend him. At this point, the river goddess Aegina, hesitating for a moment, thoughtfully said, could it be because of Hera? Upon hearing this, Athena glanced at her, scaring Aegina into lowering her head quickly, not daring to meet the piercing golden eyes of the goddess of wisdom. That's correct, Athena nodded, her smile fading slightly as she explained, because Hephaestus despises Hera. To be precise, he probably hates her more than any other god. Athena did not elaborate on the reasons, for in ancient Greek times, Hephaestus would undoubtedly hear her words. While she didn't mind, revealing such secrets to Promise could lead to disaster. Nevertheless, being a transmigrator familiar with Greek mythology, Promise naturally had his thoughts on the matter. As he pondered about the god of craftsmanship, Hephaestus, Athena suddenly turned her head and looked at the silent and serene Themis, standing in her white robe. Athena stepped aside, making way for her. Themis approached Promise, and as he sensed her presence and instinctively looked up at this dignified yet somewhat alluring goddess, she asked, Promise, would you be willing to accompany me for a while? Themis asked in her cold, clear voice. Thus, Promise followed her and left the area. With their departure, only the river goddess Aegina and Athena remained. Aegina stood nervously beside Athena. Then, Athena's golden eyes turned towards the kingdom. The sun was setting, the night and stars about to replace the twilight. In the last light of the setting sun, the people of the kingdom were still busy and noisy, appearing quite chaotic. But Athena couldn't help but smile. Having seen the kingdom at its darkest, she found this scene rather beautiful. Very nice, your country, she said. Upon hearing this, Aegina was stunned for a moment. She looked up, somewhat surprised, at Athena, probably not expecting her to say such a thing. Then, following her gaze, she also looked towards her kingdom. Before long, she too smiled, a blend of happiness and pride evident as she responded to Athena. Thank you. By the way, you've fallen in love with that child, haven't you? This seemingly casual question caused Aegina to freeze completely. But soon, she relaxed again, for she had never intended to hide anything from the eyes of the wise goddess or the goddess of justice. Yes, she nodded, turning her gaze towards the direction where Promise had followed Themis, his figure disappearing in the distance. I have fallen in love with that child, but please forgive me, wise goddess, for in that high tower, he was the only one who reached out to me. Moreover, I can never forget the scene of him standing before me, and standing before Hera. It was like seeing a ray of light piercing through the abyss just as one was about to fall into it. That night, knowing the boy stood before Hera, pleading for her blessing, not out of ignorance but fully aware of everything, she felt overwhelmed with astonishment and guilt, mixed with deep gratitude and anxiety. If Themis had not appeared, Aegina's first instinct would have been to push Promise away. For she did not want him to fall into the abyss with her. From the beginning, she never believed Hera would truly bestow a blessing. As Athena looked at her gentle smile, about to speak. But rest assured, wise goddess, I do not intend to do anything. Aegina retracted her gaze, looking at Athena with a somewhat forlorn expression, and said with a bitter smile, because even though I appear in my most beautiful form before him, his eyes do not hold my image. I understand what you're worried about, that I might harm him, but how could I possibly hurt him? Athena's golden eyes quietly observed the candid Aegina for a moment, saying nothing more. But, wise goddess, you seem to like that child a lot. Looking curiously at Athena, Aegina's courage in asking such a question seemed surprising, but Athena eventually answered, at first, it was just a small interest. You know I love heroes. Aegina nodded. Both Greeks and gods knew Athena's love for heroes. So initially, I wasn't very interested in him. He seemed too fragile, like a gust of wind could knock him over. Indeed, Aegina agreed, but precisely because of that, when he stood before me, before the noble Queen Hera, how could I remain unmoved? And later, he presented me with a painting, a very beautiful one, which I loved. I intended to grant his wish. Do you know what his wish was? Athena smiled and, without waiting for Aegina to answer, continued, he wished to become a hero and desired a glorious end. And, Aegina blinked. Yes, to die gloriously, Athena confirmed. Because it was so intriguing, I agreed. But even then, I still only saw him as an interesting child, not someone worth competing for. But this time, due to Themis, everything was disrupted, yet I also saw his demeanor in the courtroom. Let me tell you something amusing. Athena's smile grew. When that child first descended from Chiron's mountain, every time he encountered bandits, he would defeat them and make them swear to proclaim his name to the first 100 people they met. How adorable, Aegina couldn't help but exclaim. Yes, but this same child, who yearns to be a hero and for the land to sing of his existence, gave you all a dream during the trial. Athena continued, when the dream ended, people naturally forgot everything. Hearing this, Aegina was momentarily stunned, then she finally realized and looked at Athena. By then, Athena had already turned her gaze towards the direction where Promise had left with Themis, and said, so, for the first time, I wondered. Is it too wasteful to just let him go to Hera? The goddess of fate raises her head to you. Published by Web Novel. Fate, I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. Promise transmigrated to the type moon world and became one of the students of Waver Velvet at the clock tower. But a dream must eventually come to an end. Upon waking from a night's sleep, he recalled his identity as a transmigrator and also discovered his golden finger. A heroic spirit class card. It can take Promise to different eras, and by leaving behind corresponding legends, he can ultimately ascend to the throne of heroes. He thus traveled to ancient Greek mythology and Norse mythology. Promise, I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes? What are you waiting for? Come on, kill me. P.S. This book is not a traditional simulator story. Its content mainly revolves around the Age of Gods, hence the Age of Gods is a long narrative. I didn't use type moon in the title cause it was already too large. Yup, this is a translation, cause why not? The credit goes to the original author. It's just fate, and so, if the original author is reading this and wants me to remove it, then please leave a review below. Link, https://trxs.cc/tongren/8889.html. Join my Patreon to read 30 chapters advance. Patreon.com/obby28. Late at night. Tonight there was a beautiful full moon, and its bright light illuminated the entire land. Following Themis, Promise walked for several hours, and during this time, the goddess did not say a word. However, the boy did not feel tired. His eyes were bright and full of energy. After all, he had just eaten a golden apple not long ago. He was already full of energy, and the golden apple made his stamina overflow. Just as Promise began to find the path increasingly familiar and was feeling puzzled, Themis's sudden words made him pause. Actually, if it weren't for me, you should have been following Athena to the temple of Hephaestus, the god of craftsmanship, meeting that god. Hearing this, Promise instinctively looked towards Themis in front of him. Because this was Athena's original plan for your trial. Walking ahead of Promise, leading the way, she spoke in an emotionless tone. She prepared this relatively easy trial for you with the intention of meeting the god of craftsmanship, Hephaestus, as your reward. This way, she could give you the ability to move around the world without fearing that a gust of wind would blow you to the underworld, thus allowing you to fulfill your promise to her. The river goddess Aegina was meant to be your first painting, prepared by Athena. However, everything was completely disrupted by my rival. Hearing this, Promise began to understand the nature of this trial, but I suppose you have always been curious about why I appeared suddenly at that time and ultimately placed you in the judgment seat. Promise nodded honestly. He had always been curious about this. Themis did not answer. She simply quickened her pace. Promise hurried to keep up, and after some time, he finally realized why this path seemed so familiar. This was where he had stayed when he painted that picture of the kingdom for Aegina. A place on the mountainside overlooking the entire kingdom. When I was painting, was this goddess standing beside me? No, Athena must have been there too. I remember wondering why, despite staying there for so long, no wild animals disturbed me, not even a single flying insect. With these thoughts, Promise couldn't help but glance at Themis beside him. But with her face covered by the white cloth, he could not discern anything. And just as he was thinking this and blinked, he saw his canvas appear before him, and the paintbrush that was in his luggage was now in his hand. Wait, does that mean? Just as Promise instinctively looked towards Themis. It is not me, because you are not yet able to depict me, the latter said, explaining, even if I allowed you to paint me as you did Athena, once the painting leaves me, it will still quickly fade. Hearing this, Promise felt a pang of regret, but then he saw Themis's right hand draw out the sword of judgment, the sword that could cut through all injustice and evil in the world. As if sensing his thoughts, Themis responded. That's right, child, paint it onto your canvas. She said, your journey has just begun, and it will protect you along the way until... She didn't finish her sentence. She simply placed the sword down and then came beside Promise, helping him lift the paintbrush. And although it was just a sword, when Promise regained his senses, having been fully immersed in his painting with Themis's assistance, the sun had already risen. Promise put down his paintbrush, and a wave of exhaustion washed over him. Promise. Hearing the voice by his ear, he instinctively turned his head, and a golden apple was placed into his mouth. Promise blinked, looking at Themis. Another golden apple. He then obediently ate it, feeling his energy and spirit recover, and couldn't help but marvel at how wonderful it was. It's just a pity that the two he had saved up were all sacrificed to Hera. As Promise thought this, Themis suddenly took out 2 more golden apples and placed them in his hands. He was stunned and looked up at her. Counting the first time, we've met 3 times in total, so here are 3 golden apples. Themis explained, but her explanation only confused Promise more. What does that mean? It sounds like every time I meet you gods, I get a golden apple. As Promise thought this, he noticed Themis seemed to be gazing into the distance, even though her eyes were covered by the white cloth. Following her gaze, he saw the kingdom that had awakened from a night's dream. Even from a distance, he could vaguely see the people of the kingdom moving about, bustling in a scene of prosperity. Seeing this, and recalling the initial image of the kingdom ravaged by disasters and plague, Promise naturally smiled. And at that moment, the reason I placed you in the judgment seat is simple. From the moment we first met, I saw this future through the scales of judgment. When we first met, I asked the scales 2 questions. Are you just and kind, and is your judgment fair? And now I have the answers. As she spoke, the scales of judgment appeared once again in Themis's left hand. It was still swaying, representing Promise's uncertain future, both abandoned and cherished by the goddess of fate. That day, I asked you why you came here, what feelings you had standing before Hera. Your answer was that you came because you wanted to. And I think if I asked you now why, despite wanting to become a hero, you chose to deliver a dream judgment during that trial, your answer would be. I didn't think that far ahead. Because if it weren't for Promise's judgment turning everything into a dream known only to the gods, the feat of judging gods would have brought him unimaginable fame. But at that time, Promise simply believed it was the best outcome. Yes, despite its flaws, it was the best outcome he could think of under the circumstances. The kingdom was restored to its original prosperity, those who shouldn't have died returned to the world, and the goddess in the high tower smiled, having regained what she had lost. Even Hera did not lose anything, after all, her rival built a temple for her and became her most loyal devotee, praying to her every morning. This wasn't the first time such a choice had been made. Back in Jason's homeland, in that kingdom, facing the imminent wrath of Hera, Promise had also achieved what he believed to be the best outcome. Hera, who had mistaken him for Jason and was ready to bestow all glory upon him, lost nothing and gained even more. And Jason, trusting in Promise's promise and courage, did not hesitate to seek the golden fleece, and found hope for the future. Whether you were just and kind, the scales of judgment did not provide an answer. This shows that your future cannot be observed by fate, and it also means, child, you don't have an answer in your heart either. Holding the scales, Themis told Promise, and this time, her previously cold voice was much gentler. Athena has already told me about your promise and her vow, but, child, have you ever thought about what kind of hero you want to be, and what kind of end you truly desire? Promise was stunned, looking at the goddess of justice before him. In Greek mythology, there was a hero named Achilles. His father was the great hero Peleus, and his mother was the sea goddess Thetis. Before he was born, his mother knew from the goddess of fate that her child would die in battle. He will be famous, but he will not live to old age, dying young on the battlefield. This was the prophecy the goddess of fate told Thetis. In response to Achilles' birth, Thetis held his heel and dipped him in the river Styx, making his entire body invulnerable except for the heel she held, which did not touch the river water, leaving a weak spot. In addition, she also forbade him from going to war, hoping this would escape the notice of the goddess of fate, but after learning all this, Achilles responded to his mother. Rather than living a peaceful life under your great power, mother, I would rather burn my life on the battlefield, fighting bravely. Even if it is short, I want to live gloriously. That was Achilles' choice, the finale of an epic story. When Themis asked Promise, he immediately thought of this story and realized he truly could not answer the question posed by the goddess of justice before him. Even though the goddess of wisdom has promised you a grand finale, child, I hope that when that day comes, it will be your own choice, a result you yearn for and decide in your heart. Seeing that Promise did not answer, Themis was not concerned and continued speaking softly, but you need not worry too much, for your journey has just begun. Along this path, I believe you will eventually find your answer. Until then, my sword will protect you. And child, when you have your answer, please use your brush to paint me on your canvas. Promise's green eyes reflected the goddess of justice, Themis. The sunlight shone on her, making her appear radiant. I understand, goddess Themis. After a long time, Promise looked up at Themis and nodded firmly. Then said with utmost seriousness, there will come a day when I am worthy of painting you, goddess Themis, on my canvas. Then, do we have a deal? The latter smiled and asked softly. Yes, Promise also smiled at this moment, we have a deal. I look forward to that day, and I believe it won't be too far off, for, as I said from the beginning, I already have the answer in my heart. With these words, Themis once again raised the swaying scales of judgment in front of Promise. Clad in her white robe, she stood illuminated by the sunlight, with her back to the kingdom that had awakened from a night's dream, and the temple built by the river goddess Aegina. She reached out, steadying the continuously swaying scales, and in Promise's watchful gaze, gently raised the side representing goodness. Go forth, child, and let your name, your deeds, be known to the entire world. And then, that afternoon, Promise departed. He left the kingdom, bidding farewell to the river goddess Aegina. Aegina had known for a while that Promise would leave, but she hadn't expected it to be so soon. At first, she seemed quite flustered and even thought about asking him to stay, but in the end, she chose to give her blessing. Go, Promise, may your future journeys be illuminated by the sun, and may the stars and moon watch over you, guiding your way. Aegina had intended to give everything to Promise, the accumulated wealth of the kingdom, even the crown and throne that symbolized royal authority, but Promise ultimately accepted none of it. He left behind only a wish that made the sad, tearful Aegina eventually smile again. Though Promise still didn't have a clear idea of what kind of hero he wanted to become or what kind of end he would choose, he did have one goal. Please help spread my name. I am a student of the centaur sage Chiron, and I will become a hero and leave my name in this world. After nearly 3 months, Promise finally left the place. His next destination was quite clear. After all, in 3 months' time, Jason, who had been waiting for his news, must have grown quite anxious. Promise, carrying his little book of grudges and the sword of judgment that would protect him on this journey, set out to meet the heroes who were either already famous or destined to become renowned in ancient Greece. He would invite them to join him in Jason's homeland, to complete the trial given to him and Jason by Queen Hera, the most famous story in Greek mythology, the legend of the Argo. But, while that was the plan, where exactly were they now? Should he perhaps prepare an offering and ask Athena or Hera? As Promise pondered this question, he hadn't walked far outside the kingdom when he suddenly saw a familiar figure under a large tree by the roadside. It was a delicate-looking girl, dressed in a white garment of ancient Greek style, with a few strands of white hair peeking out from her hood. She sat with her eyes closed, holding a crystal ball, seemingly asleep under the shade of the tree. Promise looked at her in surprise, recognizing the petite girl before him. He had seen her before, in Hera's temple in Jason's homeland. She was the goddess of fate who had foretold that Promise would bring glory to Hera. Clotho. And just as Promise was staring at her in surprise, wondering why the goddess of fate had appeared here. Perhaps sensing his gaze, Clotho's eyebrows trembled slightly before she slowly opened her eyes. Although she couldn't actually see anything due to the white cloth over her eyes. The goddess of fate, Clotho, raised her head towards Promise. Respecting fate, or defying fate? Published by web novel. Fate, I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes? Promise transmigrated to the type moon world and became one of the students of Waver Velvet at the clock tower. But a dream must eventually come to an end. Upon waking from a night's sleep, he recalled his identity as a transmigrator and also discovered his golden finger. A heroic spirit class card. It can take Promise to different eras, and by leaving behind corresponding legends, he can ultimately ascend to the throne of heroes. He thus traveled to ancient Greek mythology and Norse mythology. Promise, I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes? What are you waiting for? Come on, kill me. P.S. This book is not a traditional simulator story. Its content mainly revolves around the Age of Gods, hence the Age of Gods is a long narrative. I didn't use Type Moon in the title cause it was already too large. Yup, this is a translation, cause why not? The credit goes to the original author. It's just fate, and so, if the original author is reading this and wants me to remove it, then please leave a review below. Link, https://trxs.cc/tongren/8889.html. Join my Patreon to read 30 chapters advance. Patreon.com/Abi28. Promise, student of the centaur sage Chiron, you have shamed the goddess of fate. Under the afternoon shade of the tree, the awakened goddess of fate, Clotho, raised her head and, trying to suppress her voice, spoke with a tone of authority to Promise. But looking at the petite goddess in front of him, who was trying hard to look at him and was still rubbing her eyes from having just woken up, Promise couldn't feel any sense of authority. However, Promise could tell that Clotho had come specifically for him. Goddess Clotho, may I ask what I have done wrong? So, after thinking for a moment, he asked as he stood before Clotho. You have revived those who were supposed to be dead, continued things that were meant to be destroyed, and furthermore. Clotho pointed towards Aegina's kingdom in the distance and paused. Furthermore, you made me change and revise my prophecy for Queen Hera again and again. You have interfered with fate, turning what was orderly into chaos, shaming the goddess of fate. Therefore, Promise, student of the centaur sage Chiron, do you understand your mistake? As Clotho's words fell, seeing her visibly angry and indignant, anyone else in this world standing here might have turned pale and fled in panic. After all, to shame and anger a god, especially a goddess of fate, was almost equivalent to being sentenced to death. But Promise didn't. He looked at the goddess of fate before him, pouting in anger, and couldn't help but chuckle before replying, so that's the reason. But goddess Clotho, I wasn't the one who did these things. It was goddess Themis, goddess Athena, and Queen Hera, wasn't it? Clotho was silent for a moment before replying, actually, back with Jason's incident, as a goddess of fate, I let you off the hook. Although you altered some aspects of fate, you still returned everything to its original course, so I didn't blame you. But this time, it's different. Do you know how much disaster your arbitrary decisions have brought to this world? Not just in the mortal realm, but even the gods are now running around because of the fate you've altered. The entire world is in chaos. Clotho spoke sternly to Promise. Well, this was quite easy to understand. Think of the world as a book, and the spindle of fate controlled by the goddess of fate is like a script or story already fixed in the book. If you compare it to a machine, it would be the preset program. The goddesses of fate are responsible for guarding and smoothing the threads of fate, ensuring the world runs orderly. Promise's actions undoubtedly disrupted all this, altering the fixed script and causing a bug in the program. To ensure the world runs properly, the goddesses of fate have to reconnect the broken threads of fate to the world. They have to write new stories and fix the bugs to get the world running again. That's why Clotho fell asleep here. She didn't fall asleep out of boredom while waiting for Promise, but purely out of exhaustion. During this period, she and her two sisters have been doing one thing. Working overtime, and working overtime again. Therefore, Promise should feel fortunate that the one seeking him out is the youngest and most delicate of the goddesses of fate, Clotho, and not one of her elder sisters. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a conversation, but a chase with a spindle. So, Goddess Clotho, have you come to punish me? Promise naturally followed up with this question. But Clotho fell silent again upon hearing this. And if I say that even if time were to rewind and we did it all over again, I would still make the same choices as I did now. Clotho was stunned, raising her blindfolded eyes to look at Promise again. Because I believe I haven't done anything wrong, the latter replied, turning his gaze towards the now barely visible kingdom. I don't know what disasters my actions have brought to this world, but I do know that the people there seem to be doing quite well. Unexpectedly, Clotho did not refute his words. Because when fate was altered, as they wove the new future, they naturally saw the kingdom's renewed state. But that's because the goddesses are helping you, Clotho answered seriously. And do you know that during that process, if you had taken even one wrong step, you would have faced completely different consequences, likely leading to utter ruin. The fate of the world isn't easily altered. In most cases, those who try to change fate end up being toyed with by it. Even so, I think I might still fight against certain fates in the future, Promise replied to Clotho, the goddess of fate. To his surprise, instead of getting angry, she asked, why? Because I suddenly feel like I can try to do more things, Promise answered. Promise was a transmigrator, so he knew a lot from the beginning. For instance, he knew that Chiron, the teacher who had taken care of him for 3 years and secretly protected him and Jason when they descended the mountain, would ultimately be shot in the throat by Hercules with an arrow soaked in the hydra's venom. Due to the agony caused by the poison, Chiron would eventually relinquish his divinity to Zeus and embrace death. Additionally, he knew that Hercules, who had been kind to him, would go mad due to Hera's curse and kill his own wife and children, suffering torment for the rest of his life. Promise's purpose in this world was straightforward: to leave his mark using his golden finger, the heroic spirit class card, and ultimately reach the throne of heroes. Because the quality of a heroic spirit was related to their legend, he actively participated in various legendary stories, getting to know the heroes. Descending the mountain with Jason and then setting off to find the other heroes wasn't just to bring them onto the Argo. He also hoped to join more legendary stories along the way. Thus, Promise initially didn't have many additional thoughts, but today, the goddess of justice, Themis, had told him that even with his vow to the goddess of wisdom, Athena, he could still make his own choices. So even though it's supposedly impossible to change fate, now I suddenly want to see if I can witness different outcomes. Besides, honestly, it does feel rather heroic. Promise said this and couldn't help but laugh. A hero who defies fate, huh? That sounds pretty good. So even though I have come before you specifically, even though I have warned you like this, between respecting fate and defying fate, you still choose the latter, right? The goddess of fate, Clotho, asked. In Greek mythology, there's a story like this. When the great hero Hercules left the centaur sage Chiron and bid farewell to his teacher, Zeus sent 2 goddesses before him. One was the goddess of vice, Kakia, and the other was the goddess of virtue, Oret. Ultimately, Hercules chose the goddess of virtue, Oret. From then on, his life followed this path. Fate is no trifling matter. Since you insist, I will let you personally experience the consequences. Clotho was angry, and this time it was different. Although her expression seemed calm, her words revealed a blatant disdain for Promise. Promise had changed the fates of the river goddess Aegina and her people, causing them to work much harder. However, Clotho also saw the prosperity of the kingdom and the smiles on their faces. Therefore, she didn't actually dislike Promise. Her purpose in coming here was merely to inform him of the seriousness of his actions and to warn him against attempting to interfere with fate again. But now, things had changed. In the next moment, the spindle of fate appeared in Clotho's hand. Using her power, she displayed the threads of the world's fate before Promise. Promise found himself in a special temple, encompassing everything in the world, with threads representing everyone's fate winding throughout the temple. The delicate goddess of fate, Clotho, wandered among the threads, touching them as she searched for the appropriate fate. He didn't know how much time had passed, but eventually, she stopped before a particular thread of fate. When she picked it up, the temple vanished from Promise's sight. Coming back to his senses, he realized he was still standing under the tree's shade, conversing with the goddess of fate, Clotho, in the afternoon sunlight. The only difference was that she now held a thread of fate in her hand. Since you choose to defy fate, I, Clotho, the goddess of fate, will give you this opportunity. To the east, about 5 days' journey from here, there is a town where you will find someone you are looking for. His name is Actaeon, a friend from your time studying under the centaur sage Chiron. Clotho, gazing into fate, spoke to him. He has offended the moon goddess Artemis and is about to die. Aren't you looking for people to invite on your quest for the golden fleece? Without the help of any goddess, if you truly have the courage, go and face the wrath of the capricious moon goddess Artemis. Then, you will see if you can truly bear the cost of defying fate. The Moon Goddess, and Entomimo no Me. Published by web novel. Fate, I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. Promise transmigrated to the type moon world and became one of the students of Waver Velvet at the clock tower. But a dream must eventually come to an end. Upon waking from a night's sleep, he recalled his identity as a transmigrator and also discovered his golden finger. A heroic spirit class card. It can take Promise to different eras, and by leaving behind corresponding legends, he can ultimately ascend to the throne of heroes. He thus traveled to ancient Greek mythology and Norse mythology. Promise, I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. What are you waiting for? Come on, kill me. P.S. This book is not a traditional simulator story. Its content mainly revolves around the Age of Gods, hence the Age of Gods is a long narrative. I didn't use Type Moon in the title cause it was already too large. Yup, this is a translation, cause why not? The credit goes to the original author. It's just fate, and so, if the original author is reading this and wants me to remove it, then please leave a review below. Link, https://trxs.cc/tongren/8889.html. Join my Patreon to read 30 chapters advance. Patreon.com/obby28. The anger of the goddess of fate, Clotho, was not without reason. In Greek mythology, predetermined fate was often unchangeable. Even the gods had to abide by this rule. Those who dared to defy fate invariably ended up being toyed with by it, meeting an even more tragic end. For example, Sisyphus, who feared death and deceived the gods of the underworld, was punished to eternally push a boulder up a hill, only for it to roll back down each time, leading to a life of endless, meaningless toil. Incidentally, Sisyphus had a connection to the river goddess Aegina. Remember when Zeus, in the form of an eagle, took Aegina away, and her father pursued them? Actually, Aegina's father did not know about this at first, but it was Sisyphus who happened to see it. In exchange for a promise of a spring that would never dry up from the river god, Sisyphus told him what had happened. This brought about his death and Zeus's retribution. Another typical case is the tragic story of Oedipus. Despite knowing his fate from the beginning and constantly struggling against it, he ultimately killed his father and married his mother unknowingly. When his mother discovered the truth, she committed suicide out of shame, and Oedipus, filled with sorrow, blinded himself and eventually died in despair. Therefore, for the stubborn Promise who chose to defy fate despite warnings, Clotho was naturally very angry. She revealed Actaeon's fate to Promise, hoping he would learn a lesson. 5 days later, following the direction pointed out by Clotho, Promise arrived at the town. Upon arrival, he noticed the small town was unusually bustling today, with many hunters gathered, discussing something fervently in groups. Yes, Promise had come, of course. Whether it was the news of Actaeon's imminent death, the intention to recruit him for the Argo, or to participate in his original legend, he had no reason not to come. As Promise walked along the road, curiously observing the gathered crowd. Promise? A somewhat familiar voice suddenly called out to him. Turning his head instinctively, Promise saw a handsome young man with red hair among the crowd, looking at him in disbelief. Meleager, after a brief moment of surprise, he called out his name. Meleager, one of Chiron's students, had once taught Promise hunting skills during their time at Pelion. He was also the Prince of Calydon, who initiated the legendary Caledonian boar hunt in Greek mythology. Incidentally, after that event, he ended up killing his 2 uncles and ultimately died by his mother's hand. The root cause of all this was a woman Meleager fell in love with at first sight. Her name was Atalanta. At that moment, move aside. A cold voice came from behind, making Promise turn around instinctively only to see a woman in beautiful emerald green clothing. She wasn't adorned with the elegance and splendor of a princess but possessed a unique charm. Her light yellow hair was mixed with strands of green, and her eyes were as sharp as an animal's. Promise looked at her in surprise. He recognized her identity at once. Atalanta. Wait, what is she doing here? As Promise was contemplating this question, Atalanta, holding freshly hunted prey, frowned at the black-haired boy blocking her path. Move aside, she said again, this time even colder. Finally coming back to his senses, he quickly stepped aside and watched her back as she walked past. Isn't she a beautiful woman? Meleager, who had somehow appeared beside Promise, spoke with a soft tone. The latter turned to see Meleager staring at Atalanta's back, his eyes full of admiration. Beautiful, I can't argue with that, but she does have thorns. And I know you'll end up dying horribly because of her. Wait, hold on, this doesn't make sense. Did I stumble into the wrong storyline? Realizing something was off, he looked around and couldn't help but ask Meleager, Meleager, is this place Caledon? Caledon? The latter tilted his head. No, it isn't. It's not? Promise was puzzled and asked him, if it's not, then why are you here? And as he spoke, he glanced at the bustling surroundings and the figure of Atalanta ahead. We're here because of the great goddess Artemis's oracle. That's why we gathered here. Wait, that's not the main point. Promise, why are you here? Meleager's eyes widened in disbelief. Did Chiron actually let you leave the mountain? Chiron must be out of his mind. With his exclamation, Promise noticed several people around them were now looking at him. Even Atalanta had turned around and was looking at him with obvious curiosity. Teacher didn't exactly agree, but he did in the end. Promise replied honestly after thinking there was no need to hide the truth. I initially snuck out with Jason. I knew it. Meleager wasn't surprised at all and nodded. Only Jason would be gullible enough to be convinced by you to leave the mountain. True, Promise nodded as well. But why did you seem to know I had left the mountain from the start? And looking around, he realized many people were discussing him. Since when did I become so famous? Promise looked puzzled. Did you forget what you've done in the oracle you carry? Meleager couldn't help but laugh. Your adventure with Jason has spread far and wide. Many people know that you're out to choose heroes and invite them to join the quest for the Golden Fleece. And Meleager burst into laughter, barely able to speak between fits of laughter. You really went crazy trying to get famous, making those bandits swear such oaths. You don't know how hard I laughed when I ran into those guys, listening to them seriously recounting your deeds. I almost collapsed from laughing so hard. It was indeed memorable, even after all this time. I can't forget about it. Atalanta nodded, and her emerald eyes naturally reflected the image of the black-haired, green-eyed boy in front of her. Especially when looking at his youthful face, which exuded an artistic vibe that hardly matched the notion of a hero, and remembering the bandits' oaths, it felt even stranger. Many people around seemed to share this sentiment, and the laughter grew louder. You really are something, Meleager said, both amused and exasperated. He reached out and ruffled Promise's hair, saying with mock irritation, only that fool Jason would go along with your nonsense. When Promise was at Pelion, he had good relationships with many people. Apart from his abundant energy, which meant everyone spent some time with him, the main reason was his age. Promise was only 16, and his youthful innocence hadn't completely faded. Even Theseus, who had ascended the mountain with him, was actually a few years older. What do you mean nonsense? Didn't you just say that I carry the oracle of Queen Hera? Don't you want to join the quest for the Golden Fleece? Meleager, after all, was one of the crew members of the Argo. As Promise said this, the people who had been laughing around them suddenly fell silent. And they looked at him with eyes now filled with fervor. Even Atalanta's eyes showed a hint of interest. Seeing the shift in atmosphere, Meleager quickly grabbed his hand and led him away, taking him to a room in the small town. Once the door was closed and no one had followed, he finally relaxed. Do you know how dangerous that was just now? Meleager couldn't help but scold Promise, but before he could continue. What's the danger? If I'm not mistaken, the content of the oracle is probably that under the watchful eyes of the great Queen Hera, I will choose powerful heroes to embark on the adventure to retrieve the Golden Fleece. Promise replied calmly as he sat down and poured himself a glass of water. Since that's the case, no one would dare to harm me. They would only think about how to please me or prove that they are worthy to join me. Meleager was stunned upon hearing this. After thinking it over carefully, he realized Promise was right. No, wait, speaking of which, why have you been missing for over 3 months, as if you suddenly disappeared? Meleager quickly refocused and sat down in front of Promise, saying, you don't know how worried Theseus was when he found out. He ran to Jason and angrily scolded him for letting you go alone. After all, you don't even have the ability to protect yourself. Promise looked at Meleager, feeling a bit frustrated, even though he knew this guy was speaking the truth and was concerned about him. With Promise's constitution, which made goddesses want to give him golden apples and pray he wouldn't be blown to the underworld by a gust of wind, he could barely handle a couple of weak bandits. But this was ancient Greece, a time filled with beasts, monsters, and other dangers. Promise should be grateful for the protection of the goddesses, otherwise, the nymphs in the forest would have long taken advantage of his wandering alone. Even so, he was really tempted to smack Meleager with the sword depicting the goddess Themis. But in the end, he just thought about it. I got delayed by some matters. Anyway, let's not talk about that. Meleager, what are you doing here? Promise changed the subject, frowning as he looked at Meleager and asked, and the oracle of the goddess Artemis. What does that mean? He hadn't forgotten his purpose or Clotho's words. In fact, when she mentioned that Actaeon would die at the hands of the moon goddess Artemis, he already understood what was going on. Although Actaeon was Chiron's student, he never boarded the Argo and didn't leave behind any notable legends. He died early at the hands of the moon goddess Artemis, and his death was extremely tragic. Actaeon was also a hunter who had learned excellent hunting skills from Chiron. After coming down from the mountain, he organized groups to hunt in the mountains every day. They exchanged their game for money or offered it as sacrifices to the gods. One day, due to the intense heat of the sun, Actaeon left the group to find a cool place to rest. While looking for a shady spot, he stumbled upon a beautiful giant deer with antlers that seemed to be made of gold, shining brightly in the sunlight. Seeing such a beautiful and rare golden antlered deer, Actaeon was instantly excited. If he could hunt this rare game, it would bring him not only wealth but also great fame. He hid quietly and, using his excellent hunting skills, managed to hit its vital spot. To his surprise, despite being shot in a vital area, the injured golden antlered deer managed to escape, prompting Actaeon to chase after it. He pursued it deep into the forest, unknowingly entering a forbidden area for humans, the sacred land of the moon goddess Artemis. He followed the deer to a beautiful lake, where he finally caught up with it. There, he saw Artemis, who had heard the deer's cries of pain from afar, had already dressed and emerged from the lake. Actaeon stood dumbfounded, watching the beautiful goddess, who was still dripping with water, holding his prey in her arms. When he finally snapped out of his stupor, he was met with the full fury of the moon goddess Artemis. Artemis cursed him by splashing him with the lake's water, transforming him into a giant deer the size of a human. She then used arrows to drive him away. She didn't kill Actaeon directly because it wouldn't quell her anger. Artemis drove the panicked Actaeon toward his friends, who ultimately killed him with their arrows. Until the very end, his friends joyfully hunted the giant deer while calling out Actaeon's name. So, at first, Promise thought it would be simple. Just stop Actaeon from chasing the golden antlered deer, and ensure he didn't meet Artemis. But things were never that simple. You don't know, then why are you here? Despite his confusion, Meleager explained the situation to Promise. A week ago, Artemis had descended an oracle, announcing that she would host a special hunt in the ancient forest outside the town. The victor of this hunt would have the opportunity to meet her and receive a gift from her. It's said that the target of the hunt is a special giant deer, one that is more majestic and taller than a human. Meleager said to Promise, for certain reasons, I must complete this hunt and meet the great goddess Artemis. Because, I must save my country. Seeing him say this with utmost seriousness, Promise fell silent. He naturally knew why Meleager needed to meet Artemis. Artemis had left a monstrous beast in his kingdom, a boar as large as a small mountain. This curse, much like the one Hera had previously placed, could only be lifted with her personal consent. At the same time, Promise realized the true nature of the giant deer in the hunt. Undoubtedly, the events had already transpired. Actaeon had been turned into a giant deer by the moon goddess Artemis. And ultimately, he would die by his friend's arrows. Fate. I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. Published by web novel. Promise transmigrated to the type moon world and became one of the students of Waver Velvet at the clock tower. But a dream must eventually come to an end. Upon waking from a night's sleep, he recalled his identity as a transmigrator and also discovered his golden finger. A heroic spirit class card. It can take Promise to different eras, and by leaving behind corresponding legends, he can ultimately ascend to the throne of heroes. He thus traveled to ancient Greek mythology and Norse mythology. Promise, I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes? What are you waiting for? Come on, kill me. P.S. This book is not a traditional simulator story. Its content mainly revolves around the Age of Gods, hence the Age of Gods is a long narrative. I didn't use Type Moon in the title cause it was already too large. Yup, this is a translation, cause why not? The credit goes to the original author, it's just fate, and so, if the original author is reading this and wants me to remove it, then please leave a review below. Link, https://trxs.cc/tongren/8889.html. Join my Patreon to read 30 chapters advance. Patreon.com/obby28. Promise, don't die. When is the hunt scheduled? Understanding that Actaeon had already been transformed into a giant deer by Artemis, Promise asked the red-haired Meleager after a brief silence. It seems you really don't know. It's tomorrow night, when the great goddess of the night, Nyx, drives her chariot of night to the human world. The beautiful moon goddess Artemis will hang the full moon in the sky to illuminate our hunting festival. Tomorrow. Hearing this, Promise fell silent. By the way, Promise, are you planning to join the hunt? Meleager asked, but before Promise could respond, he laughed and answered for him. Ah, right, I shouldn't have asked. After all, you who aspire to become a great hero would never pass up such an opportunity. But let me make it clear, this time, I absolutely cannot let you win. Meleager's expression became serious again as he said to Promise, for the sake of my country, I must win this hunting festival and meet the beautiful goddess Artemis. This is my only chance. Promise fell silent again, his green eyes fixed on Meleager for a while before he spoke. By the way, Meleager, do you know where Actaeon is? I actually came here to find him. Actaeon? Meleager was taken aback for a moment, then looked at Promise with a puzzled expression and said, is he here? I don't think I've seen him. Why are you looking for him? For the adventure of the Golden Fleece. Hearing this answer, Meleager's face showed a look of realization. Wait a minute, before you see him, there's something you need to say to me, right? Seeing Meleager suddenly staring intently at him, Promise tilted his head in confusion and asked, is there? Of course there is, you haven't invited me yet. The latter stood up abruptly, anxiously saying to him. Why should I invite you? Promise said calmly while turning and rummaging through his luggage for his grudge notebook. Opening it, he began to read aloud. A year ago, that afternoon, just after Chiron agreed to let you leave the mountain, you ran straight to me to brag. And when I followed you, you grabbed me, tied me up, and threw me in front of Chiron, laughing at me. You said I should just stay on the mountain and paint, and never think about coming down. Did you really write all this down? Meleager was shocked. That's right, Promise nodded. It's not just you, Heracles and Theseus can't escape either. Speaking of which, I haven't even settled the score with you for laughing at me in front of everyone just now. Well, Meleager looked a bit embarrassed. Then, as if something occurred to him, he leaned over to look at Promise's notebook and said, wait, the real reason you left Jason to come find us, could it be? That's right, who said I came to invite you on the ship to go on an adventure? Promise nodded, speaking loudly. I'm here to settle old scores honorably. A gentleman's revenge can wait 10 years. You all rejected me and left me on the mountain back then. Now, I'm going to make you all regret it. Want to get on the ship? Want to create great achievements under the watchful eye of the great Hera? Fine, do it now, right now, beg me. Meleager looked at the proud Promise sitting there, feeling both amused and helpless. Finally, he raised his hands and said, all right, you vengeful guy. I was wrong, okay? I admit my mistake. Sigh, I must say, Teacher Chiron really lost his mind. How could he let you come down the mountain? And that guy Jason, I'll definitely beat him up the next time I see him. After saying that, Aur paused, looking at Promise in front of him. Then he smiled again and said, but actually, I was hesitating at first about whether I should go or not. After all, I'm not sure if the matter at home can really be resolved. But now I've decided, I must go. Seeing Meleager's sudden determination, Promise couldn't help but feel curious and asked, why? The latter looked at him and said irritably, why do you think? I don't know why Teacher Chiron didn't tie you up and take you back to the mountain by now. All I know is that if I don't go to watch over you, this guy who wants to die so badly will definitely die out there. Hearing this, Promise unexpectedly didn't refute. Because when he and Jason went down the mountain, that was indeed his plan. He intended to die on the Argo. Moreover, if it weren't for the oath with Athena, Chiron might really not have returned to the mountain at that time. He probably would have kept following until now. Thinking about it, it will indeed be lively then. As if thinking of something, Meleager looked at Promise and said, because of you, after so many years, we might all really gather together for the first time. All with one purpose. Promise, don't die. That night, the flames illuminated the starry night. Hunters who had gathered here due to Artemis's oracle were singing praises of her greatness and holding a grand feast. Artemis. She is one of the 12 Olympian gods, the goddess of the moon, and also the goddess of hunting, worshipped by hunters. She is also, like Athena, a virgin goddess who swore to remain pure forever and is the protector of unmarried maidens. In Greek mythology, Artemis and Athena jointly oversee the maidenhood of girls, and when a girl is to marry, she would return her virgin girdle to the temple of Athena or Artemis. She would then enter the married phase overseen by Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty, and Hera, the queen of the gods. Artemis is also the goddess most familiar to Promise in this era, the goddess who chokes people. So why isn't that bear here? In the feast illuminated by flames and filled with laughter. Promise, dressed in a light black hunting outfit, scanned the crowd around him, feeling a bit melancholic. At the same time, he was the center of attention at the feast. Although in the afternoon, many had laughed at him due to the bandit incident, no one could ignore his current status. He was the boy under the gaze of Queen Hera, walking across the vast land of Greece, searching for the bravest warriors for the noble queen, bringing them together in the kingdom of Iolcos to embark on the adventure to find the golden fleece under the watchful eyes of the gods. During the 3 months Promise was completing Athena's oracle, this news had already spread across the continent by bards. And because of this, when he arrived at the feast with Meleager, he had no time to rest. Hunters gathered, introducing themselves to him, hoping to gain his favor. Some even proudly stated that it would be an honor for Promise to have them on the ship, saying they were destined to accomplish great feats under the watchful eyes of the gods, gaining wealth and glory. Even Atalanta had come to the feast, quietly staying in a corner. Thus, it wasn't long before Promise grew tired of it all. In truth, his purpose for attending the feast tonight was to find the bear. The bear's name was Orion. Yes, the same Orion who, during the heroic summoning, was supposed to appear but was replaced by the goddess Artemis due to her love, appearing as a peculiar non-human, non-beast creature, mascot. And this guy was even a grand servant. Promise wasn't familiar with him, in fact, he had never met him because Orion wasn't a student of Chiron. To save Actaeon, Promise had planned to find Orion and sell him to Artemis. Unfortunately, it seemed he didn't come, and honestly, he wasn't even sure if Orion was from this era. Eventually, as more and more people gathered around Promise, it was unexpectedly Atalanta who stepped in to save him. She sternly reprimanded the crowd, stating that the hunting festival under Artemis's gaze would take place tomorrow night, and that Artemis must be watching them, urging them to be mindful of their behavior. She also said that if they believed themselves to be brave and strong, the hunting festival would be the best proof. Only those who performed well in this hunting festival would be qualified to participate in the Golden Fleece adventure under the watchful eyes of the gods. After speaking, unable to tolerate the atmosphere any longer, Atalanta turned and left. As Promise finally breathed a sigh of relief. What a beautiful huntress, marrying her would make any man so lucky, right, Promise? The Goddess of Fate is angry. Published by Web Novel. Fate, I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. Promise transmigrated to the Type Moon world and became one of the students of Waver Velvet at the Clock Tower. But a dream must eventually come to an end. Upon waking from a night's sleep, he recalled his identity as a transmigrator and also discovered his golden finger. A heroic spirit class card. It can take promise to different eras, and by leaving behind corresponding legends, he can ultimately ascend to the throne of heroes. He thus traveled to ancient Greek mythology and Norse mythology. Promise. I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes? What are you waiting for? Come on, kill me. P.S. This book is not a traditional simulator story. Its content mainly revolves around the Age of Gods, hence the Age of Gods is a long narrative. I didn't use Type Moon in the title cause it was already too large. Yup, this is a translation, cause why not? The credit goes to the original author. It's just fate, and so, if the original author is reading this and wants me to remove it, then please leave a review below. Link, https://trxs.cc/tongren/8889.html. Join my Patreon to read 30 chapters advance. Patreon.com/obby28. Hearing what Meleager says, Promise couldn't help but turn around and look at the red-haired young man beside him. At this moment, Meleager was staring at Atalanta's beautiful back as she walked away, unable to take his eyes away. His eyes were full of admiration. But Promise only felt speechless, even a bit of a headache. I won't argue with the beauty part. And if possible, I would also like to get along with her. After all, she will be quite active in the future. I definitely don't want to end up like Jason, getting kicked by her in the future. But Meleager, you really don't have the fortune, and because of her, you will die a horrible death in the future. In the future, when Meleager hosted the Caledonian Hunt Festival, it was under the witness of Artemis. As Artemis's most loyal follower, Atalanta naturally came to Caledon. She was the only woman in that hunting festival. Many heroes were dissatisfied, believing that this sacred festival should not be tainted by women. But Meleager, who fell in love with Atalanta at first sight, strongly defended her presence. After the beast was hunted, Meleager even awarded the boarskin, a symbol of great honor, to Atalanta, which displeased his two uncles. His uncles tried to snatch the boarskin back from Atalanta, and to protect her, Meleager ended up killing his own uncles. When his mother found out, she was so grief-stricken and enraged by the deaths of her brothers at her son's hands that she threw the log symbolizing Meleager's life into the fire. As the flames roared, engulfing the entire room, she heard her son's agonizing screams within the flames. Realizing what she had done, she ultimately perished in the fire along with her son. Incidentally, even then, Meleager never won Atalanta's heart because she wasn't even aware of these events. In fact, even after everything ended, if one asked her who Meleager was, she would probably have to think for a while before remembering. So, licking the boots gets you nowhere. Promise patted Meleager's shoulder sincerely, then looked around without waiting for HS' reaction. He noticed that because of Atalanta's words, these people actually calmed down, but at the same time, their fighting spirit was ignited even more. Promise clearly came to save Actaeon, but he felt that Actaeon's situation had worsened because of his presence. Soon, he left the banquet. After inquiring, he confirmed that Orion was not in the area at all. Thus, the idea of using the bear as a sacrificial offering was undoubtedly scrapped. After all, the hunting festival would take place the next night. While Promise was pondering what to do next, when he opened the door, he saw the room faintly illuminated by moonlight, with the white-robed Clotho sitting on a chair and her flawless jade feet suspending in the air. She was holding the crystal ball that specially contained Promise's fate, sitting quietly and waiting for him for a long time. Seeing her, Promise was slightly stunned, then turned around to close the door and light the room's candle. He wasn't surprised by her appearance. When the faint candlelight lit up the room under the night, illuminating Clotho's delicate features and the few strands of white hair falling from her hood. You surprise me, Promise. Her gentle yet serious voice, mixed with a bit of confusion, said, I originally thought you would tell everything to your friend Meleager, or go directly to see the goddess Artemis, but you didn't seem to plan on doing that. Because I know that telling Meleager about Actaeon and the truth about this hunt will only cause him pain and won't change anything. Promise said as he walked to face Clotho. Because he has a reason to do so, he must meet the goddess Artemis to save his country. As for why I didn't go directly to see the goddess Artemis, that's because I feel it would be an even worse choice. Also, did you guide Meleager to come here? After all, his arrival timing was too coincidental. Facing Promise's green eyes, Clotho was silent for a moment before replying. Even before meeting you, I guided him here because it is his original destiny. He is the friend destined to kill Actaeon. He is also the future hero who will save Caledon under the watch of the goddess Artemis. In other words, if I save Actaeon and prevent Meleager from meeting the goddess Artemis because of this, if he doesn't get Artemis's forgiveness, Caledon will be destroyed. Promise followed Clotho's line of thought and asked. That's right, the latter nodded slightly, a faint smile appearing on her face. And not only that, your feeling is correct. You can't save Actaeon. Even if you go to see the goddess Artemis now. Because Actaeon hunted Artemis's beloved golden horned deer and completely angered her, this hunt must have a result. When the pain suffered by the golden horned deer is fully returned to Actaeon, the goddess Artemis will not stop this hunting festival. So, Promise, have you witnessed the greatness of destiny now? Do you still wish to oppose fate? After saying that, perhaps feeling she had finally asserted her dignity as a goddess of fate in front of Promise. Clotho, sitting on the chair, couldn't help but lightly swing her feet and smile. However, Promise didn't immediately reply. He just turned his head, those clear green eyes gazing out the window, looking into the distance. Actually, Promise knew they should be watching him. After all, that wise goddess wouldn't miss something this interesting. And that just goddess Themis might be watching too. If he wanted, those two goddesses might respond to him. Moreover, in this ancient Greek divine era, seeking help from gods wasn't shameful. Seeing him not answering, Clotho raised her head. Her eyes were white, unable to see the present as the goddess of future fate, but she still guessed Promise's thoughts. Are you thinking about whether you should seek help from the wise goddess, the just goddess, or the great queen? Hearing Clotho's question, Promise smiled after regaining his senses and looking at her. He stepped forward again, came to her front. Then crouched down, looking at this delicate goddess of fate under the faint light of the lamp and the moonlight streaming in from outside. I don't intend to do that, and, sorry goddess, Clotho, I still can't accept your goodwill. Promise spoke to Clotho with a tone filled with apology. In fact, he held quite a good impression of this goddess. Because in the Hera temple during their first meeting, Clotho had helped him a lot. She informed Hera that Promise was the one who would bring glory to her. And although it was Athena's request, Clotho had not yet revealed Athena and Themis' matters to Queen Hera. Moreover, even days ago, when Promise made the choice to defy fate and angered Clotho, she still used a gentle approach to tell him that fate was unchangeable, bringing him to witness this destined fate personally. And today, she specially appeared to advise him again. Clotho remained silent. Due to the strand of Athena's hair tied on Promise's hand, she could not peer into Promise's true thoughts, but she heard the sincere apology in his words. Thus, she knew Promise was not underestimating her, but she also couldn't understand his reasons, so she couldn't help but ask, why? Because that day, when you appeared before me, I had already made my choice in the face of fate. Promise replied, and even if I abandon this one time, what about the future? If I give up on Actaeon, then what about Meleager's matter? Should I watch him kill his two uncles and then be killed by his mother? If I abandon them all, will I finally watch my mentor Chiron, who has always cared for and worried about me, die in pain? How do you know so much about fate? Clotho couldn't help but ask again. The latter smiled faintly, and that's why I won't seek their help. They, being kind, will undoubtedly respond to my pleas, but, that day in front of fate, I made my own decision. Just as Heracles chose virtue over vice before the goddesses, and upheld virtue all his life without changing. So you choose to fight against me all your life? Clotho was about to pretend to be very angry. No, Promise interrupted her with a smile, saying, I only hope to show you, the goddess of fate, a better future. Just like the matter with the goddess Aegina. Though you came to criticize me that day, I knew you were actually happy for them, right? Clotho was stunned, remaining silent for a long time. When she finally came to her senses, she tried to pretend to be angry and retorted, no, it was very troublesome to clean up after you, I wasn't happy. And you keep contradicting me, trying to change the fate I control. You want to make me, the goddess of fate, ashamed. Promise was speechless. He stood up with a smile. Thank you, goddess Clotho, I will complete this hunt, because you have already told me that to calm the anger of the goddess Artemis, I must hunt the already transformed giant deer Actaeon. Even if his opponents were the excellent hunters gathered by Artemis's oracle. Even among them, there were the truly graduated hunter Meleager from Chiron, and the future famous beautiful hunter Atalanta. And then I will go to see the goddess Artemis, to seek forgiveness for Actaeon, and also to obtain the qualification to hunt the Caledonian boar. Promise looked at the stunned Clotho. I will, as you said that day, face the goddess Artemis, confront her anger, and rewrite everything. Hearing this, Clotho remained silent for a long time. Squat down, she said. Promise blinked in confusion. Squat down. Realizing that Clotho was indeed angry, Promise obediently squatted down. Then, in the next second, Clotho reached out, pinched his face, and even squeezed it particularly hard twice. After doing all this, she jumped off the chair, hugged her crystal ball, and angrily prepared to leave. But halfway through, she seemed to think of something and hesitated for a while. So she ran back, placed the crystal ball aside. Under Promise's watch, she took out a golden apple from her pocket and stuffed it into his hand. For you, you annoying guy. After saying that, she finally left angrily with the crystal ball containing Promise's fate. And all of this, as he initially said, was watched by the goddesses secretly observing him. And they let out bell-like laughter under the starry night. The hunting sacrifice witnessed by the gods begins. Published by web novel. Fate. I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. Promise transmigrated to the type moon world and became one of the students of Waver Velvet at the clock tower. But a dream must eventually come to an end. Upon waking from a night's sleep, he recalled his identity as a transmigrator and also discovered his golden finger. A heroic spirit class card. It can take Promise to different eras, and by leaving behind corresponding legends, he can ultimately ascend to the throne of heroes. He thus traveled to ancient Greek mythology and Norse mythology. Promise. I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. What are you waiting for? Come on, kill me. P.S. This book is not a traditional simulator story. Its content mainly revolves around the Age of Gods, hence the Age of Gods is a long narrative. I didn't use Type Moon in the title cause it was already too large. Yup, this is a translation, cause why not? The credit goes to the original author, it's just fate, and so, if the original author is reading this and wants me to remove it, then please leave a review below. Link, https://trxs.cc/tongren/8889.html. Join my Patreon to read 30 chapters advance. Patreon.com/obby28. The next day. Nightfall. The moon goddess Artemis gave an oracle that the time for hunting in the ancient forest had arrived. In ancient Greek mythology, Nyx, the goddess of night, drove the chariot of night from the underworld to the human world and cast the curtain of night into the sky. The moon goddess Artemis hung a full moon in the sky, and today's moonlight was obviously much brighter than usual, covering the earth in the dark night with a layer of silver frost. Since yesterday's banquet lasted for a long time, the hunters chose to rest at home during the day today, and only gathered together again when night gradually fell. They set out from the town in a mighty procession, with torches lit and accompanied by hounds. Promise was also among them, but he was at the end. He wore a black hunting outfit, carrying a hunting bow that Meleager had found for him in the past few days, which even Greek huntresses considered too light. After all, the special bow and arrows Chiron had made for him had already been sacrificed to Queen Hera in the kingdom of the river goddess Aegina. Promise also carried a silver lyre he had specially bought in the small town during the day. And it would be the key to determining whether tonight's hunt would be successful. Moonlight shone on his smooth black hair, quietly following the crowd, his clear green eyes were bright and clear. You shouldn't participate in this hunt. At that moment, a cold female voice suddenly came from the side. Promise turned his head instinctively and found that Atalanta had actually come to his side. He was slightly stunned because he knew Atalanta disliked men. She despised Greek heroes who displayed excessive brutality in hunting, equating the fight with offerings to the gods and ravaging them. She was the most devout follower of the moon goddess Artemis. To be precise, Atalanta always had been before her faith collapsed. For this reason, she had early on vowed to Artemis, dedicating her life to her, never to marry, and to remain pure. And the reason for this lay in Atalanta's background. In fact, she was an abandoned orphan. She grew up in a kingdom called Arcadia and was actually the princess of that kingdom. She should have had a happy and exciting life, but because she was a girl and not a boy, her once hopeful father became furious. He ultimately abandoned her, just a newborn, in the icy winter forest. This scene was witnessed by the moon goddess Artemis. Seeing that Atalanta was cute, she couldn't bear to let her die and took her in, even feeding her with bear's milk until she grew up. Therefore, Atalanta's faith in Artemis was not only devout but also fanatical. Though in the future, when she saw the true nature of the so-called pure virgin goddess Artemis, her faith was utterly shattered. Because of this, Atalanta loved children, and her reason for participating in the future Holy Grail War was to create a world where all abandoned children could be happy. This hunt is her very dangerous. Atalanta's emerald eyes looked at the frail boy in front of her, unable to help but advise, there's still time, hurry and withdraw. Otherwise, you might die in vain in this hunting festival. Promise blinked, looking at the beautiful huntress in green clothes in front of him. She didn't possess the gentleness or splendor of a princess, but her wild beauty made her even more captivating. He looked at her, then at himself. Suddenly, a flash of realization appeared in his eyes. He understood why Atalanta suddenly spoke to him. Indeed, with his physique that made the goddesses of ancient Greece want to stuff him with golden apples and his fellow students of Chiron kneel and beg him not to die. Anyone would be confused. Moreover, though Atalanta seemed cold and difficult to approach, she was essentially a very good person. Why is it dangerous? So Promise asked her curiously, isn't this just a simple hunt? Atalanta remained silent for a while, then looked up at the beautiful full moon tonight and turned her head to the distant, dark, and eerie ancient forest under the full moon. Intuition, she replied calmly. To be honest, she didn't expect Promise to believe her. She herself was puzzled why she felt this trip was dangerous when it was just hunting a non-aggressive giant deer. As for the ancient forest at night, to a skilled hunter like Atalanta, it was as familiar as home. But hearing this, Promise frowned and soon a thoughtful expression appeared in his eyes. After all, he never forgot that this world was the Nasuverse. His true identity was still a future mage apprentice in the clock tower. So Promise thought of something. A student who graduated from Chiron, cursed by the moon goddess Artemis to become a giant deer. Could it be that Actaeon had turned into a monster similar to the Minotaur? With a thoughtful look, Promise nodded slightly and smiled at Atalanta, thank you. This pure gratitude made Atalanta unexpectedly freeze and stop in her tracks. After a moment, she hurriedly caught up with Promise and looked at him again. After scrutinizing the young boy who probably couldn't even draw his own bow, she shook her head again and said, you really aren't suited for this hunting festival. Though I don't know why the Great Queen chose you, if you believe this hunt is dangerous, then while there's still time, hurry and withdraw. Hearing this, Promise blinked and looked at the beautiful female hunter in green clothes in front of him. Although she did not have the delicate and luxurious appearance of a princess, her wild beauty made her even more attention-grabbing. He looked at her, then looked at himself. Immediately, a look of realization flashed in his eyes. Well, he understood why Atalanta suddenly spoke to him. Indeed, given his physique, which even the goddesses of ancient Greek mythology couldn't help but bestow golden apples upon, and his fellow centaur sage Chiron's apprentices would kneel and beg for mercy, it was no wonder anyone who saw him would be confused. Moreover, although Atalanta appeared cold and hard to approach, she was essentially a very good woman. Why is it dangerous? He couldn't help but curiously ask her, isn't this just a simple hunt? The latter was silent for a while upon hearing this, then she looked up at the beautiful full moon tonight and then turned to look at the distant dark, eerie ancient forest under the moon. Intuition, Atalanta answered calmly. To be honest, she didn't expect Promise to believe her. After all, she herself was puzzled as to why she felt this trip was dangerous when it was just hunting a non-aggressive giant deer. As for the ancient forest at night, for a hunter as excellent as Atalanta, it was the most familiar home. However, upon hearing this, Promise frowned, and soon a thoughtful expression appeared in his eyes. After all, he never forgot that this world was from the Nasuverse. His true identity was still an apprentice mage in the clock tower in the future. Thus, he thought of something. Students who graduated from Chiron's tutelage were cursed by the moon goddess Artemis and turned into giant deer. Actaeon, that guy, wouldn't he turn into a monster similar to the Minotaur? With this thought, he nodded gently and smiled at Atalanta. Thank you. This pure gratitude stunned Atalanta unexpectedly, making her stop in her tracks. After a moment of regaining her senses, she quickly walked up and looked at him again. After some examination, seeing the young boy in front of her, who probably couldn't even draw her bow, she couldn't help but shake her head again and said, you really are not suited to participate in this hunting ritual. Although I don't know why the great goddess Hera chose you, if you believe this hunt is dangerous, then withdraw now while you still can. As she spoke, she couldn't help but glance at the lyre Promise carried. What serious hunter brings a musical instrument to a hunt? But, truth be told, looking at that instrument, then at the boy in front of her, who had nothing to do with hunters or heroes but was adorned with an artistic aura, even in plain black hunting clothes that couldn't hide his unique temperament, Atalanta found herself somewhat looking forward to the moment he played the lyre. Because she thought the music must be beautiful. No, thank you for your kindness, but, beautiful huntress, you heard it too yesterday, didn't you? The news those thieves were spreading? Promise blinked at Atalanta and smiled, saying, my goal is to become the most dazzling hero in this world. Therefore, how could I possibly avoid this hunting ritual under the gaze of the goddess Artemis? If he hadn't said that, it would have been fine. But once he did, Atalanta couldn't help but want to laugh. She couldn't forget the time when those thieves came out to intercept her. Just as she was ready to draw her bow and shoot, she remembered what they said. And their utterly hopeless expressions. It gave Atalanta a tremendous shock at the time. Do as you please, after all, this hunting ritual will soon be over. Saying this, she tried hard to maintain her facial expression, proudly raising her head, because I will surely win. Under the watchful eyes of the beautiful and noble goddess Artemis, I have no possibility of failure. With that, Atalanta stopped paying attention to Promise and turned to head to the front. However, halfway there, she suddenly stopped, hesitated for a moment, then turned back, her holy green eyes looking at Promise again as she spoke. Atalanta, that's my name. Promise was slightly taken aback, then smiled again, nodding and responding, yes, hello Miss Atalanta, my name is Promise. I know, I heard it from the thieves, the guy who dreams of becoming a hero. With that, Atalanta couldn't help but smile, then turned and proudly walked away. As soon as she left, Promise barely had time to feel the peace beside him. What did she just say to you? What were you talking about? Why did she look so happy? And she even smiled at you. Oh, did you see that? She looked so beautiful when she smiled. Meleager, catching the scent, came over and looked at Promise with a face full of nervousness. The latter was speechless, then rolled his eyes and said, she said you were very handsome. With that, Promise stopped paying attention to the temporarily stunned, then utterly delighted and excited Meleager. Just like that, after some time passed, those gathered for Artemis's hunting ritual finally reached their destination. They extinguished their torches, exchanged glances, then each took their dogs and bows and disappeared into the forest. After all, everyone knew at this moment that the beautiful moon goddess Artemis was watching them. The full moon in the sky was the best proof. Before entering, Atalanta turned her head to take a special look at Promise. Seeing Meleager beside Promise, she said nothing more and swiftly moved into the trees, gracefully disappearing into the ancient forest. Promise would accompany Meleager. Not only did Atalanta think so, but almost everyone present thought the same. After all, looking at him, no one believed he could win in this hunting ritual under the watchful eyes of the gods. They all thought he was here to select a strong hunter and invite the victor of this ritual to join the quest for the Golden Fleece. But, you say you want to act alone? The red-haired youth Meleager looked at Promise in surprise. Yeah, I don't know about others, but what's with that expression? The latter said helplessly. Did you forget that some of my hunting skills were taught by you? I'm not completely clueless. In terms of skills, Promise didn't actually have much of a problem, it's just. But you can't even draw a regular bow. Hearing this, Promise squinted his eyes, turned around, and took out a small notebook from his bag. Hey, wait, don't, please don't. Seeing him about to write something down in his notebook, Meleager quickly stopped him. I didn't say I wouldn't agree with you, but why do you suddenly want to act alone? Promise glanced at Meleager, thought for a moment, and said, this is a hunting ritual under the gaze of the goddess Artemis. Only one victor can reach her, and, Meleager, don't you still have to save your homeland? Hearing this, the latter was stunned, looking at him for a while before hesitantly saying, but you. Don't worry, I won't die. Promise put away the notebook and said, I promised Jason that I would accompany him on the journey to find the Golden Fleece. And I also promised the great goddess Hera to gather the world's heroes to join me. So before that, I won't be seeking death. Although I've always been courting death, as you all know, even if I die, it must be a grand and heroic death. Hearing Promise's response, Meleager was silent for a long time. After a long while, he sighed in relief. Looking seriously at Promise, he said, thank you. What are you talking about? Hurry up and go, you're gross. Hearing this, Meleager couldn't help but laugh, then he stopped being sentimental, turned around, and ran at full speed, soon disappearing from Promise's sight. Once he was gone, Promise stood quietly in place. After a few more minutes passed, he finally confirmed that he was alone. He looked up, his emerald green eyes gazing at the bright full moon in the sky. Then he turned and entered the forest. Under the witness of the gods, the hunting ritual had now officially begun. Fate, I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. Published by Web Novel. Promise transmigrated to the type moon world and became one of the students of Waver Velvet at the clock tower. But a dream must eventually come to an end. Upon waking from a night's sleep, he recalled his identity as a transmigrator and also discovered his golden finger. A heroic spirit class card. It can take Promise to different eras, and by leaving behind corresponding legends, he can ultimately ascend to the throne of heroes. He thus traveled to ancient Greek mythology and Norse mythology. Promise, I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes? What are you waiting for? Come on, kill me. P.S. This book is not a traditional simulator story. Its content mainly revolves around the Age of Gods, hence the Age of Gods is a long narrative. I didn't use Type Moon in the title cause it was already too large. Yup, this is a translation, cause why not? The credit goes to the original author. It's just fate, and so, if the original author is reading this and wants me to remove it, then please leave a review below. Link, https://trxs.cc/tongren/8889.html. Join my Patreon to read 30 chapters advance. Patreon.com/obby28. The Sound of Lyre. He is the child you favor? Under the starry night sky, as the hunting ritual officially began, Promise didn't know that the moment he arrived at this place, he was already seen by the goddess Artemis. More precisely, 3 goddesses. 3 beautiful goddesses gathered at the deepest part of the ancient forest, by the pavilion beside the lake illuminated by moonlight, the sacred ground of the moon goddess Artemis. And the one who spoke was Artemis. The clear lake reflected her beautiful figure. Dressed in a long dress, Artemis was lying lazily on her beloved golden horned deer. Her waist-length silver hair spread out, and her sky-blue eyes looked far into the distance at Promise through the full moon. And with just one look, she recognized him, for the marks left on Promise by Hera, Athena, and the goddess of justice were too conspicuous in the eyes of the gods. That's right, Athena, with her beautiful golden eyes, sitting in the pavilion by the lake, smiled proudly and said, "What do you think? He's quite an adorable child, isn't he?" Hearing this, Artemis couldn't help but look at Athena with curiosity. She didn't understand why this wise goddess now seemed a bit like the time when Hera caught her and bragged about it. Wait, isn't that child a follower of Hera? Tilting her head slightly in thought, Artemis felt tired the next second and stopped thinking about it. Continuing to lie on her golden horned deer, she spoke, "But he looks so weak. How could someone like him possibly reach me?" "No, he will come," answered the last of the three goddesses to Artemis. Sitting before Athena, dressed in a white robe with her eyes covered by white cloth, was Themis, the goddess of justice, speaking coolly, "Because I have already heard the choice he made before fate." "Is that so?" Artemis looked at Themis in puzzlement, then glanced back at Promise in the distance. After watching him for a while, she couldn't help but say, "But he clearly doesn't seem to have any intention of hunting." Promise, dressed in black hunting attire, was quickly traversing the ancient forest under the full moon's light. And just as Artemis had said, he indeed had no intention of hunting. Because he knew better than anyone else that under normal circumstances, he couldn't possibly win against Meleager and Atalanta. Even though he carried the sword of judgment left by Themis, the goddess of justice, but even that wouldn't be it. Therefore, tonight, Promise planned to hunt Actaeon, who had turned into a giant deer, in a very special way. He moved swiftly through the ancient forest, making no effort to conceal his presence. As a result, many hunters spotted him, including Atalanta. When she noticed that the red-haired youth was not by Promise's side, she frowned, hesitating whether to follow him. Since arriving here, the unease in Atalanta's heart had grown stronger. But what she didn't expect was that in just a brief moment of hesitation, Promise had completely disappeared from her sight. After hesitating for a while longer, Atalanta decided not to pursue him. After all, her main objective at this moment was undoubtedly to win the hunt and meet the goddess she admired, and he would be safe. After all, even though he is weak, he is also the disciple of Chiron. Promise continued on for a long time, not knowing where his destination lay. As he delved deeper into the forest, his speed gradually slowed. The forests of ancient Greece were filled with swamps and teeming with beasts that posed a danger to humans, especially at night when they hunted. Soon, Promise found himself wounded for various reasons. Eventually, when a giant snake as thick as a leg lurked in the shadows and suddenly lunged at him, the picture of the sword of judgment on his body flew out on its own and decapitated the snake. Seeing the sword of judgment hovering in the air, protecting Promise, Artemis finally realized and looked at Themis in great surprise. Themis was the goddess of justice and the respected judge even among the gods. So she was genuinely astonished that the meticulous Themis would care so much about the fragile boy, even giving him her sword. Wait a minute, if he has your sword, why is he still going deeper into the forest instead of hunting that bastard? As she said this, Artemis turned her gaze to the other side of the hunting ground. At this time, Atalanta had actually already found the giant deer from Artemis's oracle. To be precise, many people had found it. It had been nearly an hour since the hunting ritual began. At the same time, Atalanta finally understood the source of her vague unease. Because it was not a giant deer, but a monster. Angry, pained, and sorrowful roars echoed through the ancient forest. Under the light of the full moon, standing on two legs before the hunters was a giant stagman. He had huge antlers on his head, a long, slender neck, long pointed ears, and spotted fur covering his body. His eyes were blood red, his entire being exuded an aura of doom, and he was already stained with fresh blood. Beside him lay hunters who had tried to stop him, now writhing in agony. Indeed, he was Actaeon, the one Promise sought, transformed into a monstrous stag by Artemis's curse. About half an hour after the hunting ritual began, the hunters spotted his massive figure. They had been pursuing him ever since. The giant stag swung his hoofed hands with terrifying strength, the mere gusts of wind from his movements making it difficult for many gathered hunters to stand their ground. Among them, only the red-haired youth Meleager could stand before him. Meleager stood bravely in front of the monster, holding a sword, his eyes showing no trace of fear. Yet, for some reason, listening to the monster's mournful cries, he felt an inexplicable sorrow in his heart. Actaeon would be killed by his friend, dying in his friend's arms. This was the prophecy given by Clotho, the goddess of fate. And the one who would undoubtedly kill Actaeon, according to that prophecy, was Meleager. "Beautiful huntress, please help me, stop it." Standing in front of the monster, Meleagros urgently called out to Atalanta, who was hidden in the shadows, shooting arrows. "We can't let it escape, or Promise will be in danger." Hearing this, Atalanta frowned deeply. But what surprised both of them and the surrounding hunters even more was that the monster, which had been fleeing, suddenly stopped. The giant stag turned its head, its blood-red eyes looking at Meleager. The latter was stunned, for in that moment, he saw a human-like surprise and confusion in the monster's eyes. "What is happening to me?" Meleager shook his head fiercely, then charged forward with his sword, shouting loudly, "Stop it. Under the witness of the great goddess Artemis, we will surely achieve victory." Facing Meleager, who was charging at him with a sword, the stag, upon regaining its senses, saw the red hair getting closer and closer. In desperation, it finally grew fierce, leaping heavily and slamming its hoofed hands onto the ground. The terrifying force caused the ground to shake instantly, like a small earthquake, making it hard for anyone to stand steady. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the stag leapt over Meleager and quickly disappeared from his sight. Even though Atalanta, the fastest to react, immediately got up and gave chase, within just 2 or 3 minutes, she was surprised to find herself losing him. It wasn't that Actaeon, transformed into a stag, was faster than Atalanta. It was because Actaeon had lived in this area for a while and knew the terrain well. Ultimately, with no other option, Atalanta returned to the group to report that she had lost him. Meleager, hearing this, was silent for a moment before shaking his head and saying, "It's not your fault, beautiful huntress. That monster is strange. It seems to possess human-like intelligence and is very familiar with tracking techniques of hunters. But regardless, under the witness of the great moon goddess Artemis, we must drive it away, for the sake of honor and the mission of protecting the people." Meleager raised his sword high, becoming the leader of the group at that moment. Although everyone present wanted the glory of killing the stag and meeting the moon goddess Artemis, seeing its strength, they naturally had nothing more to say. "If there's a next time, I definitely won't lose him again," Atalanta declared solemnly. At this point, Athena, who had also been watching the situation, turned her gaze back and asked Artemis, who was sitting on the golden horned deer, "Artemis, did you say something just now?" Athena's voice brought the goddess back to her senses. After glancing at Athena, she naturally looked at Themis, the goddess of justice. "I said, since that child has Themis' sword, why doesn't he just kill that bastard and complete the hunt?" Artemis repeated her earlier question. "It's simple, because he would never use that sword against the hunting ritual's prey," Athena answered with a smile. Hearing this, Artemis didn't ask why. She just tilted her head in confusion and said, "In that case, doesn't he have even less of a chance? The one who should come to me tonight should be that child." As she spoke, Artemis pointed to Meleagros, who had already become the leader and was commanding the group to pursue the monster. Athena didn't refute this. She simply smiled and turned her golden eyes towards Promise. Then, as if she had discovered something, her smile grew even wider. At this moment, the full moon's light was shining down on the boy. His black hair was slightly damp, and drops of water from a small pond trickled down into his collarbone. He had taken some time to clean himself of the debris he had picked up while traversing the forest. "This should be enough, I think." Promise said this as he found a large stone beside the small pond and sat down on it. He looked up at the bright full moon in the sky, then looked down towards the path descending the mountain. From here, even if Meleager tries to catch up, it should take him some time. After speaking, he pulled out a golden apple from the luggage he had prepared earlier. Themis, the goddess of justice, had given him 2, and the goddess of fate, Clotho, had given him 1 last night. Thus, he now had 3 in total. Promise finally ate one of these golden apples given by the goddesses. Closing his eyes, he quietly felt his body recovering. Soon, when he opened his eyes again, his energy and spirit were undoubtedly at their peak. He turned his head to look at the judgment sword, which had been silently floating beside him, protecting him. Thank you, goddess Themis. As he said this, Promise reached out and gently touched the sword, which then transformed back into a canvas and fell into his hands. After putting it away, he placed his hunting bow and arrows aside and then picked up the silver lyre. Soon, Promise became familiar with the silver lyre in his hands as a faint smile appeared on his lips. He relaxed completely, once again slowly closing his eyes, recalling the teachings he received on the mountain from the centaur sage Chiron and the man whose music moved even the gods of the underworld, Orpheus. Before long, he began to gently pluck the strings of the lyre, softly humming a beautiful melody, letting the sound of the lyre gradually fill the quiet, dark depths of the ancient forest. I see. Athena, with her golden eyes reflecting the scene before her, smiled again. His hunt has begun. Fate, I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. Published by Web Novel. Promise transmigrated to the type moon world and became one of the students of Waver Velvet at the clock tower. But a dream must eventually come to an end. Upon waking from a night's sleep, he recalled his identity as a transmigrator and also discovered his golden finger. A heroic spirit class card. It can take Promise to different eras, and by leaving behind corresponding legends, he can ultimately ascend to the throne of heroes. He thus traveled to ancient Greek mythology and Norse mythology. Promise, I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. What are you waiting for? Come on, kill me. P.S. This book is not a traditional simulator story. Its content mainly revolves around the Age of Gods, hence the Age of Gods is a long narrative. I didn't use Type Moon in the title cause it was already too large. Yup, this is a translation, cause why not? The credit goes to the original author, it's just fate, and so, if the original author is reading this and wants me to remove it, then please leave a review below. Link, https://trxs.cc/tongren/8889.html. Join my Patreon to read 30 chapters advance. Patreon.com/obby28. Artemis, how cute Tilda. In truth, Promise understood better than anyone else that under normal hunting circumstances, he could not possibly win against Meleager, who had trained him for a while, or the future famed huntress of ancient Greece, Atalanta. After all, they were among the brightest stars of humanity, destined to leave their mark on this era and be celebrated by future generations. Thus, from the very beginning, he had no intention of using a bow and arrow to complete this hunt. With a final day's respite, Promise had thought of a better plan. That was to make the prey come to him willingly. Hunting? Hearing Athena say this, Artemis, who was sitting on the golden horned deer, was momentarily stunned. Pointing at the boy under the moonlight, who was placing his fingers on the strings of the lyre, feeling the night breeze in the forest with a faint smile on his lips. Then, with his mouth lightly humming a melodious tune, his fingers gently plucking the lyre, she couldn't help but ask, you call this hunting? Yes, Athena smiled faintly, her golden eyes reflecting Promise's figure, seeing through everything, and she said, this is the hunt that child found, one that will bring him victory. Artemis, you said he couldn't win the hunt tonight and come before you. Do you still think so now? The latter didn't immediately respond. Her sky blue eyes also reflected the image of Promise. He didn't look like a hunter, and just as Atalanta felt, she naturally felt the same. Thus, when Promise sat by the small pond bathed in moonlight, in the quiet depths of the forest at night, playing his silver lyre with his eyes closed, even she found this scene not out of place, but rather fitting. Watching him, Artemis then couldn't help but glance at Meleager, who was gathering the people and tending to the wounded. This was a hero. Of course, she finally answered. In that case, how about we make a bet? Athena smiled, not surprised by her answer. After all, if it had been 3 months ago, she would have made the same choice as Artemis. Promise, who seemed so fragile that a gust of wind could blow him to the underworld, did not appear to have the makings of a hero. But precisely because of this, the goddess of wisdom couldn't help but stop before him, and even the goddess of justice, Themis, removed her blindfold for him. Not just because of Promise's pure and fearless desire to become a hero, but also because he had indeed accomplished things that even heroes might not be able to do. In situations where Athena had no expectations, Promise had stood out on the altar dedicated to Hera. In the Cursed Kingdom, within the pure white courtroom, he had completed a trial even the goddess of wisdom hadn't anticipated. He is both abandoned by the goddess of fate and beloved by her, so much so that even the goddess of fate cannot arrange a definite future for him. The goddess of fate is angry at his choices, feeling he disrespects and humiliates her, but doesn't fighting against fate and rewriting destiny to create a new one also highlight the greatness of fate? Athena's words made Artemis tilt her head in confusion, completely unable to understand. But she wasn't speaking to Artemis, but rather to Themis, the goddess of justice. Athena turned to the goddess of justice and said, witness this with me, Themis, just as we did in the pure white courtroom, that most beautiful moment. The goddess of wisdom loves heroes, but more precisely, she loves that moment when a hero, seemingly in a hopeless abyss, takes steps forward, never giving up, finding that glimmer of hope, and finally leaping to the top. Standing at the highest point, basking in the most beautiful sunlight, in that dazzling instant. Hearing this, Themis, the goddess of justice with her eyes covered by white cloth, suddenly smiled lightly and then responded softly, is that so? But it seems I can't see. Athena's smile froze instantly. She glared at the goddess with a mix of exasperation and amusement, then turned her attention back to Artemis, saying, so, shall we bet? Bet. Finally, the moon goddess looked up and gave her answer. I committed an unforgivable mistake. I angered the noble deity and hunted her messenger. In Greek mythology, deer are considered the most sacred animals by goddess Artemis, and the golden horned deer is her most cherished messenger. In one of Heracles' 12 labors, he was tasked with capturing the golden horned deer. When Heracles' arrow pierced the deer's bronze hoof, and he carried its massive body back home, he was met by goddess Artemis and god Apollo. Eventually, with Athena's secret intervention, Zeus allowed Heracles to take the golden horned deer back home, releasing it that very night. Thus, on that fateful day, when the excited Actaeon pursued the golden horned deer to Artemis' sacred ground, seeing Artemis already out of her bath, calming the golden horned deer, and looked at him with immense anger. Initially captivated by the freshly bathed Artemis' beauty, Actaeon, upon coming back to his senses and realizing what he had done, knew he was doomed. Guessing her identity, the terrified Actaeon wanted to kneel and beg for forgiveness, but Artemis did not give him the chance. Whether it was his gaze or the harm inflicted on the golden horned deer, both had pushed Artemis into a rage. She cursed him, driving him away with arrows. Actaeon fled for a long time, initially unaware of the changes to his body, feeling lucky to have survived the hands of a goddess. Until he stopped by a spring, exhausted and thirsty. As he prepared to drink the sweet spring water, he finally noticed his transformed hooves and the monster reflected in the water. He was startled, trying to scream, but the sounds that emerged were unfamiliar. Panicked, he touched his body, eventually realizing he had become a monster and quickly understood that it was the goddess' punishment. Since that day, Actaeon, too afraid to return to the human world, lived in the ancient forest. Being an excellent hunter, he was never discovered by those who came to the mountains, until Artemis organized this hunting ritual more than half a month later. Under normal circumstances, with Actaeon's skills and the hunters thinking it was just a regular hunt, it could have taken an entire night without anyone finding him. But Aktien exposed himself intentionally, not knowing what had happened. Seeing Meleager, his friend, among the crowd, he couldn't contain his emotions and appeared before him. He wanted to seek help from Meleager, to tell him what had happened through tears, but could only produce monstrous roars. Naturally, this led to Meleager, Arrow and the hunters' ensuing chase. In such a situation, he finally heard the truth from the hunters. Artemis had initiated the hunting ritual, and the prey was him, transformed into a monster. Since you like hunting so much, you shall become the hunted and die in the hunt. Without a doubt, this was the punishment goddess gave to Aktien. To ensure he suffered, Artemis deliberately preserved his consciousness. However, because of this, although many hunters were injured, there were no fatalities. Aktien, who had been hiding in a panic because he had turned into a monster and his entire body had been strengthened, still managed to hear Meleager words and even saw him raising his sword and pointing at the others, preparing to lead them in an attack against him. At that moment, the hunters relit their torches. Their flames illuminated the silent night forest, gradually shrinking the space Aktien could move in. In the darkness, Aktien licked his bleeding body. Watching the flames that represented the driving away of night and beasts getting closer and closer, a deep despair filled his eyes. He knew he was going to die. And he would die at the hands of his friend. Aktien didn't want to die, so as he prepared to move deeper into the forest, he suddenly recalled Meleager, recent words. Promise was also participating in this hunting ritual. Thinking of him, Aktien couldn't help but remember Promise's oft-repeated words, that he would eventually die a glorious death on the path to becoming a hero. It seems I won't die gloriously on the path to becoming a hero, but rather as a monster hunted by heroes. At this moment, Aktien realized more than ever that he had indeed become a monster. Looking down at his dear body and bronze hooves, despair finally overwhelmed him, and he lowered his head, giving up resistance. After some time, a sudden shout of surprise rang out. Someone had found him. Meleager rushed over and saw the massive monster sitting there, eyes closed, seemingly waiting for death, and was momentarily stunned. Then he quickly called for others to tie Aktien with ropes from a distance, knowing full well from earlier how strong the monster was. As Aktien prepared to quietly accept his death, his dear ears twitched slightly, and he opened his eyes, turning his head in curiosity towards the depths of the forest. He heard a familiar sound of a lyre, the same lyre strings often heard during training with the centaur sage Chiron in the cave on Mount Pelion. Chiron's lyre strings were gentle and pleasing, Orpheus's were grand and majestic, but only Promise's lyre played ethereal and varied tunes, sometimes like wind chimes, other times like ancient lyre music, soothing and profound, cleansing the soul. Recognizing Promise's lyre music, Aktien couldn't help but recall the beautiful memories of their training days. Naturally, he felt a desire to see him, and at the same time, since I have become a monster, why not let him become the true hero who slays the monster, under the witness of goddess Artemis? What Promise didn't know was that during his studies under Chiron, he had left a significant impression on his fellow disciples, indirectly influencing them. After all, in their eyes, Promise, despite his frailty, had always been striving hard, and his dream of becoming a hero was not mere talk. He feared not even death. With this thought in mind, Aktien could no longer contain himself and started struggling with all his might. And the guards, who had begun to relax after catching the monster, were caught off guard by his sudden turn of events. Thus, Aktien easily broke free from his restraints and once again ran towards the depths of the forest. This time, Atalanta steadily pursued him. She kept her word, she would not lose him this time. She was extremely fast, there were not many people in the ancient Greece who could match her speed, hence the story of Atalanta and the golden apples. But against the transformed giant stag Aktien, even Atalanta had to use all her strength just to keep up. And this, she was unable to draw her bow effectively. After running at full speed for about 10 minutes, Atalanta, who was chasing the monster relentlessly, suddenly heard the sound of the lyre. Why is there music here? This thought had just formed in her confused mind when she remembered the lyre she had seen Promise carrying during the hunting ritual. At that time, Atalanta had thought, if Promise played the lyre, it would surely sound beautiful. Damn it. She gritted her teeth, drawing her bow while running, attempting a highly difficult shot at Aktien with all her strength. The bow in Atalanta's hands was blessed by the moon goddess Artemis, so it easily pierced the fur of the giant stag. But despite this, the monster did not stop, which greatly surprised her. Finally, after several more minutes, Atalanta saw Promise from a distance, sitting on a stone by the small pond, dressed in black, with his eyes closed, playing the lyre and softly humming. Seeing him, Atalanta, confident in her skill to shoot, did not shout a warning to Promise to run. It wasn't until she noticed the monster actually heading towards him that she realized the urgency. Great goddess Artemis, please bestow your magnificent blessings upon your most loyal follower. Atalanta knew she couldn't continue like this. She stopped, took a deep breath, then raised her bow. Under the full moon's light, she slowly drew the bow. Silver magic imbued her arrow, and with a determined gaze, Atalanta put all her effort into this shot. However, just as she was about to release the arrow, a beautiful figure appeared in the moonlight behind her, extending a delicate finger to touch the arrow lightly. The power dissipated instantly. Atalanta lowered her arrow and turned around, her emerald eyes wide with astonishment at the goddess beside her. Goddess Artemis. As the stunned Atalanta instinctively started to exclaim, the goddess placed her hand over her mouth, putting a finger to her lips and smiling gently, signaling her to remain silent. Then she turned, her sky-blue eyes filled with interest as she watched the scene before her. In her shock, Atalanta followed Artemis's gaze and saw the situation unfold. She saw the monster, which had been running at full speed, suddenly stop. It cautiously approached the boy sitting on the stone, seemingly afraid of making any noise that might disturb Promise. After some time, it finally reached Promise's side. As Atalanta watched the scene and instinctively moved to act, Artemis held her back once more. Thus, Atalanta watched as the monster quietly sat down in front of Promise. Seeing this scene, the huntress was stunned for a moment, looking at the monster, then at Promise, and finally at the beautiful goddess beside her. Hesitantly, she lowered her bow. Her tension eased with the goddess's presence. And so, the lingering, delicate sound of the lyre once again filled her ears. In the serene forest, the breeze rustled the trees, as if accompanying Promise's music. Atalanta looked up at the scene before her, at the boy playing the lyre as if unaware of everything around him. Seeing his reflection in the clear pond by the light, she had to admit that Promise's music was not only beautiful but also, rather charming. At least much more pleasing than those who were only rough and brutish. As time passed, the small animals that had fled in fear due to their sudden arrival began to reappear. Atalanta, with her sharp eyes, even spotted a few nymphs. Fireflies emitting a faint glow flew through the air, birds drawn by the music landed on Aktien, pecking curiously at his body, wondering what he was. Even the golden horned deer, which had been hiding in fear of Aktien, couldn't resist coming out to nuzzle Artemis. Watching all this, Atalanta suddenly recalled a legend. It was about the moon goddess Artemis's brother, Apollo, the god of light. Apollo, the god of light, was also the god of music and the most handsome of all gods. Legend has it he had a golden seven-string lyre, and whenever he played and sang, all creatures would be drawn to him, stopping all conflicts to listen to his music. Thinking of this legend, Atalanta looked at Promise again. After a long while, she shook her head. What am I thinking? How could he compare to the great god Apollo? Due to her respect for Artemis, she naturally held Apollo in high regard. She had even received Apollo's blessings. At this moment, Promise finally stopped playing. He slowly opened his eyes. When Promise raised his head and locked eyes with Atalanta, she instinctively straightened her posture. At that moment, she felt that his clear emerald eyes were as beautiful as the dazzling stars in the sky. The bot stood up, not speaking, and bowed to Artemis. Finally, he lowered his head and looked at the monster sitting quietly, its blood-red eyes and body exuding the stench of blood. Aktien had completely relaxed by this point, feeling that hearing this art comparable to divine music in his final moments was a fortune. Moreover, it could contribute to his friend's heroic feat. But that guy Meleager, how could he dare to bring Promise along on such a dangerous journey? Wasn't he afraid of getting beaten by Chiron? With these thoughts and worry that his blood-red eyes might scare Promise, Aktien closed his eyes again, waiting quietly for death. As he heard Promise's footsteps descending from the stone, approaching him, and the sound of rummaging for something. Finally, under Atalanta's puzzled gaze, Promise took out his little notebook. Opening it, he said, Aktien, I am here. At that instant, Aktien's eyes flew open, and he looked up in shock at Promise standing before him. However, the latter looked at him seriously and said, because you didn't take me down the mountain before, and you tricked me into waiting for you at the foot of the mountain, but instead, I met Chiron. Therefore, I have come to seek revenge. As Promise spoke seriously. Atalanta was completely stunned. What is this guy talking about? At the same time. Peef, ha ha ha, Artemis couldn't help but cover her mouth, letting out a melodious laugh. Aktien also stared at Promise for a while, and then, tears he could no longer hold back began to flow. He suddenly grabbed Promise and began to cry loudly on him. He wanted to express his suffering but could only produce low beastly sounds. Hey, hey, don't rub against me, it's dirty, and be gentle, let go of me, it hurts, I'm going to die, I'm really going to die. After a while, Promise, full of disdain, kicked Aktien away. He had almost been strangled to death by this monster. Although he wanted to die, it shouldn't be this humiliating. This guy, I have also written this grudge down. Single quote. After tidying himself up, Promise respectfully approached Artemis. Beautiful and kind goddess Artemis, I, Promise, student of the centaur sage Chiron, am honored to meet you. Seeing this, Atalanta nodded in satisfaction. Yes, respect and revere the great goddess Artemis. Wait a minute. Stunned for a moment, Atalanta suddenly turned to look at Artemis. The goddess Artemis? Yes, this was really the goddess Artemis. In a flash, Atalanta stood beside Promise, showing even more respect and nervousness towards Artemis. However, in her haste, she didn't expect that she would bump into Promise. Well, nothing happened to her but the boy fell to the ground. You're too delicate. Seeing this, Atalanta couldn't help but say to Promise, even with the goddess Artemis right in front of her. Lying on the ground, Promise rolled his eyes at Atalanta. I'm obviously normal, okay? Isn't it you, who is too tough? Watching this scene, Artemis once again let out a bell-like laugh and, to Atalanta's disbelief, stepped forward, gently helped Promise up, and even patted his head. Looking at him, she nodded slightly, and with a gentle smile, she said, yes, he is indeed a very cute child, just as Athena said. Athena's Heavy Flavor. Published by Web Novel. Fate. I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. Promise transmigrated to the type moon world and became one of the students of Waver Velvet at the clock tower. But a dream must eventually come to an end. Upon waking from a night's sleep, he recalled his identity as a transmigrator and also discovered his golden finger. A heroic spirit class card. It can take Promise to different eras, and by leaving behind corresponding legends, he can ultimately ascend to the throne of heroes. He thus traveled to ancient Greek mythology and Norse mythology. Promise. I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. What are you waiting for? Come on, kill me. P.S. This book is not a traditional simulator story. Its content mainly revolves around the Age of Gods, hence the Age of Gods is a long narrative. I didn't use Type Moon in the title cause it was already too large. Yup, this is a translation, cause why not? The credit goes to the original author, it's just fate, and so, if the original author is reading this and wants me to remove it, then please leave a review below. Link, https://trxs.cc/tongren/8889.html. Join my Patreon to read 30 chapters advance. Patreon.com/obby28. Artemis stepped in, surprising even Athena. After all, they had just made a bet, wagering that Promise would be unable to complete the hunt. She had even considered that when Aktien, cursed into a giant stag, came before Promise, she would keep an eye on Artemis. After all, she suspected that the unwilling to lose goddess might intervene. But what left her speechless was that Artemis did intervene, not to trip up Promise, but rather to help him by stopping Atalanta's arrow that was about to be released. Well, the reason was simple. When Promise ate the golden apple, adjusted his state to perfection, and forgot everything except the lyre in his hands, playing a melody as if kissed by the goddess of art herself, the forest and its creatures, even the nymphs, accompanied him in harmony. Seeing this beautiful scene, the moon goddess Artemis thought it would be too much of a pity to ruin it. So she stepped in, stopping Atalanta's arrow and enjoying this special hunt with her beloved follower. At that moment, Artemis seemed to forget the purpose of the hunting ritual and the bet with Athena. So, as she patted Promise's head, she naturally spoke her true thoughts. Yes, he is indeed as cute as Athena said. Hearing Artemis mention Athena, both Atalanta and Aktien, who was too scared to come closer, were stunned. Promise, however, showed no change in expression. After all, she knew from the beginning what was going on between him and the goddess of fate, Clotho. And the goddess of fun, whom he had already labeled a pleasure monster, would definitely not let him go. Thank you, goddess Artemis. Promise began to reply, but then he felt something gently nudging him as he turned and saw a very beautiful deer. Seeing it, Aktien's eyes widened in an instant. It was clearly the golden horned deer that Aktien had hunted, Artemis's most beloved messenger. Oh, I rarely see it being so close to anyone. Artemis blinked gently, then knelt to softly pet the golden horned deer, smiling at Promise. It seems to like you. Seeing this, Atalanta couldn't help but pout secretly. After all, the goddess she admired and revered was now praising someone else right in front of her. But seeing how happy Artemis was, she didn't want to interrupt. So she naturally turned her attention to Aktien, who stood silent and scared. Looking at this monster, the target of the hunting ritual, Atalanta thought about reclaiming the goddess's favor from Promise and worried that Aktien might harm the goddess. So she instinctively drew her bow again and aimed at him. Wait, Atalanta. Seeing this, Promise quickly stepped forward to block Aktien. At this point, Artemis finally focused on the monster, her previously gentle smile slowly fading away. Especially when the golden horned deer, seeing Aktien, instinctively hid behind Artemis, she looked at Aktien with even colder eyes. Atalanta wasn't a fool. Watching Promise stand in front of the monster, she recalled his strange interactions with it, taking out a notebook, shouting about revenge in words she didn't understand. And the monster's sudden desperate rush to Promise. It dawned on her that Promise knew the monster. So after a moment's hesitation, Atalanta lowered her arrow. She also remembered Meleager and the others who had come with them for the hunt and turned to look back. But she was puzzled to find that she couldn't see their torches or hear their noise. It was as if this place was isolated. Seeing Atalanta lower her bow, Promise didn't relax, as he noticed Artemis's demeanor had drastically changed from the gentle goddess she had been moments ago. Her eyes now looked as if she had caught someone in an affair and was ready to draw her bow and shoot them through. Facing that cold gaze, even though it wasn't directed at him, Promise couldn't help but swallow nervously. To be honest, he was always a bit afraid of Artemis, not because of the fear of dying by her hand, but because he feared being remembered by her. That would be far worse than death. Dealing with one virgin goddess was already troublesome enough, adding another one would be unbearable. But because his choices were influenced by the goddess of fate, Clotho, and for the sake of Meleager and Aktien, he had no choice but to stand before Artemis. Taking a deep breath, Promise addressed Artemis, beautiful goddess Artemis, may I ask if I have won this hunting ritual? Atalanta, still puzzled by the sudden disappearance of the others, turned to Promise and frowned, what are you talking about? Yes, Artemis nodded lightly and replied straightforwardly, you have won. Although she had made a bet with Athena, they hadn't wagered anything significant. Besides, the music from Promise and the reaction of the golden horned deer had made her quite fond of him. Thus, Artemis, who didn't particularly care who won or lost, naturally didn't mind awarding the victory to Promise. But Atalanta couldn't accept this. Even if the person in front of her was the revered Artemis, she couldn't help but urgently protest. Wait, Goddess Artemis, this. Promise didn't actually hunt. No, this child has indeed participated in the hunt and succeeded. Artemis's gaze softened again as she looked at Atalanta. And didn't you witness it with me just now? Hunting? The latter recalled the recent scene, her eyes widening in disbelief. You call that hunting? Yes, perhaps seeing her own earlier reaction mirrored in Atalanta, Artemis couldn't help but laugh. Isn't it a rather interesting hunt? Atalanta fell silent. She felt her understanding being refreshed at that moment. However, recalling the scene where the monster sat down in front of Promise, closed its eyes, and listened to the music as if awaiting death, she found she couldn't refute it. But this meant she had lost, failed in the hunt. And more importantly, she had failed in front of the goddess Artemis. Realizing this, Atalanta, as Artemis's most devoted follower, felt such shame that she even contemplated suicide. Regaining her composure, she glared fiercely at Promise. If Artemis weren't here, Atalanta, feeling deeply humiliated, would have likely pounced on Promise. Having received Artemis's confirmation, Promise breathed a sigh of relief and asked, since I have won, does that mean I can request a gift from the esteemed and beautiful goddess Artemis? Of course, Artemis nodded. As I promised, you may ask for a gift. So, what do you desire? As she spoke, Artemis suddenly paused. She tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something. She glanced at Promise, her lips moving as if conversing with someone. After a while, just as Promise began to feel uneasy, Artemis finished her conversation and smiled again. With a playful expression, she turned to Promise, blinking and saying, so, the reason you participated in the hunting ritual is this, huh? It sounds quite interesting. In that case, I can grant your request. Although I dislike him, because you were so endearing and tonight's hunt was so splendid, I can choose to forgive the sinner behind you. However, for this hunt, I will grant only one gift. With that, Artemis clapped her hands happily and continued, therefore, you must choose between Actaeon and Meleager, my dear child. You can only save one of them. At that moment, Promise understood. The one who had just spoken to Artemis must have been the goddess of wisdom, Athena. After all, such a choice could only have the flavor of Athena, too strong to miss. Promise completes his revenge. Published by Web Novel. Fate. I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. Promise transmigrated to the type moon world and became one of the students of Waver Velvet at the Clock Tower. But a dream must eventually come to an end. Upon waking from a night's sleep, he recalled his identity as a transmigrator and also discovered his golden finger. A heroic spirit class card. It can take Promise to different eras, and by leaving behind corresponding legends, he can ultimately ascend to the throne of heroes. He thus traveled to ancient Greek mythology and Norse mythology. Promise. I heard after death, you can ascend to the throne of heroes. What are you waiting for? Come on, kill me. P.S. This book is not a traditional simulator story. Its content mainly revolves around the Age of Gods, hence the Age of Gods is a long narrative. I didn't use Type Moon in the title cause it was already too large. Yup, this is a translation, cause why not? The credit goes to the original author. It's just fate, and so, if the original author is reading this and wants me to remove it, then please leave a review below. Link, https://trxs.cc/tomgren/8889.html. Join my Patreon to read 30 chapters advance. Patreon.com/obby28. The hunting ritual concluded, and the moon goddess Artemis would bestow a gift. But only one. Would it be Actaeon, cursed into a monster, or Meleager, bearing the fate of saving his kingdom? Once again, fate presented itself before Promise. Everyone turned their eyes to him, even the goddess of fate herself perked up in curiosity. In that case, please grant us a new hunting ritual, great goddess Artemis. To everyone's surprise, when faced with this fateful decision, the boy did not hesitate for long before answering, please grant us the honor of slaying the Caledonian boar. Quote. Weren't you participating in this hunt to save him? Perhaps due to his prompt reply, the moon goddess Artemis paused for a moment before pointing to Actaeon and asking. Hearing this, Actaeon was also stunned, looking at Promise in disbelief. That's right, the latter nodded, admitting to Artemis, that is indeed my purpose. After all, this is the choice I made before the goddess of fate. Observing the situation from the side, Atalanta tilted her head in confusion, unable to comprehend what was happening. After all, she still didn't know what was going on. Seeing her reaction, Artemis couldn't help but laugh, reaching out to rub Atalanta's face while she was still unresponsive. Haha, little Atalanta, your expression is so cute right now. Gee, goddess Artemis? Atalanta's eyes widened, her body stiffening, but her face soon showed joy and satisfaction. At that moment, the goddess of fate delivered an oracle, revealing the destined future of a fragile young man named Actaeon and Meleagros. A gentle voice echoed as the goddess, who had been silently watching, finally stepped onto the stage once again. She appeared from the moonlight, her long silver hair flowing, shining like the Milky Way under the full moon. The moon goddess Artemis cursed Actaeon, who hunted her golden horned deer, turning him into a monster destined to die at the hands of his unsuspecting friend, Meleager. Meleager would then stand before Artemis, praying for her blessing to save his country. Athena, with her golden eyes, looked helplessly at Artemis, who was petting a cat. She had not intended to appear yet, but she realized Artemis was not suited for this task. Even though she had explained the steps to Artemis still managed to make a mess of everything. But the future that awaited Meleager was not a happy one. Flames would consume everything he held dear, and he would die at the hands of his beloved mother. Thus, the fragile young man learned of all this. At the same time, he was actually a friend of both Actaeon and Meleager, having spent unforgettable times together under the guidance of the wise centaur Chiron. So on that day, before the goddess of fate, he made a choice. Despite the destined future, he still wanted to change everything. At this moment, Actaeon and Atalanta couldn't help but naturally focus on Athena, who was slowly approaching. They listened to this story and watched her smile gently as she approached Promise. Because he couldn't bear to see his friends harm each other, nor could he bear to see his friends die so tragically. Athena arrived in front of Promise smiling as she gently patted his head. Though he was so fragile, like he could be blown over by the wind, he still completed the nearly impossible hunt. And at this moment, he finally stood before the goddess. Athena's golden eyes gazed at the boy, who was quietly watching her. But the goddess's promised gift was only one, and the young man ultimately made a choice, pleading with the goddess to look upon Caledon, the place she had once abandoned, and bestow a new blessing. But, what about the cursed Actaeon? Have you abandoned him? Athena asked with a smile. Of course not, Promise shook his head, because I have already made a promise to the goddess of fate to show her a better future. So, what are you going to do? The goodness continued to ask, stepping aside. Promise then looked at Artemis, took a deep breath, and stepped forward to face her, saying, Beautiful goddess Artemis, I know my friend Actaeon committed an unforgivable act. Everything that has happened so far is his deserved punishment. Therefore, I won't defend him on this matter, but I think he now understands everything and regrets it deeply. As he spoke, Actaeon, still in shock, suddenly felt a tickle in his throat. He couldn't help but cough heavily, and then, to his surprise, found he could speak. Actaeon was not a foolish person. After a brief moment of shock, he immediately looked at Athena, then hurriedly got up and stood beside Promise, bowing his head in repentance to Artemis. Yes, beautiful and kind goddess Artemis, I regret my reckless actions every moment. Especially now, knowing the great trouble I have caused Promise, I am ashamed and feel unworthy of living in this world. Actaeon felt truly ashamed and even considered dying right there. What are you saying, Actaeon? I have already made a promise to the goddess of fate. Neither you nor Meleager are allowed to die, I said so. But before he could finish his words, Promise interrupted angrily. The boy turned to look at Artemis again and said, beautiful goddess Artemis, although I have already made my choice, as I answered to the goddess of wisdom Athena, I do not wish to see my friend die in front of me. The reason I chose Meleager is because I understand that one must bear the consequences of their own mistakes. Therefore, I hope the goddess Artemis can give him a chance to atone for his sins. Also, do you remember what I said at the beginning? Promise took out a small notebook from his belongings once again. Looking at Atalanta, Artemis, and Athena beside him, he finally turned to Actaeon and smiled. I came here to seek revenge. Actaeon, I haven't had the chance to avenge myself on you yet, so how could I let you die so easily? So, beautiful goddess Artemis, please grant me the chance to take my revenge on Actaeon. What kind of revenge do you want? Artemis asked with interest. Under the watchful eye of the great queen, I will embark on an adventure to find the golden fleece with Jason. Promise replied, it is an unknown adventure, filled with countless dangers, but at the same time, it is undoubtedly a great adventure. The reason I am here is to find crew members, so Actaeon's strength is necessary for me. As for the punishment. As he spoke, he looked at Actaeon's current state and couldn't help but laugh. I think he looks pretty good as he is now. So, goddess Artemis, let him accompany me on this adventure in his current form. And I will tell the world that he is your messenger, goddess Artemis. You love humanity so much that you sent him to us to help complete this grand adventure. And in the end, when we return with glory, kind goddess Artemis, please restore his name and let Actaeon return to the world of men. When Promise finished speaking, even Atalanta understood his intention completely. She then looked at her beloved goddess and said, Goddess Artemis, I think this is not appropriate. After speaking, she took a few steps to Promise's side, pointed at Actaeon, and said to the curious Artemis, because I cannot judge whether he can complete this great mission and bring back glory, so goddess Artemis, please allow me to accompany him on this adventure. I will supervise him and restrain him throughout the journey. And finally, bring that glory back to you, goddess Artemis. Promise was slightly stunned at hearing this, then looked gratefully at Atalanta. Seeing this, the latter turned her head away proudly, not looking at him. After all, she had not forgotten that during tonight's hunting ceremony, in front of goddess Artemis, Promise had defeated her, causing her to be humiliated in front of her most revered goddess. But even so, after learning everything from the goddess of wisdom Athena, she still chose to stand by Promise's side. At that moment, Artemis suddenly felt her clothes being gently tugged. She looked down in confusion and saw the golden horned deer biting her clothes. When the golden horned deer saw Artemis looking at it, it walked over to Actaeon. Although it hesitated for a moment, it eventually stood beside Actaeon and gently licked his stunned face with its tongue. At that moment, Artemis's gaze at Actaeon finally softened a bit. Are you willing to accept? She asked Actaeon. Actaeon looked up, unable to believe what he was hearing. Then he glanced at Promise, and finally lowered his head again, his eyes red, of course. Kind goddess Artemis, I will return with glory for you. All right then, the goddess smiled at Promise and said, I will grant you this, little Promise. Complete your adorable revenge. At that moment, when Promise finally heard these words from Artemis, the tension that had been building up within him finally eased a bit. Just as he couldn't help but smile, he suddenly felt something on his face. Instinctively turning his head, he saw Athena beside him. Her beautiful golden eyes, reflecting Promise's figure in the moonlight, gently poked his youthful cheek with her fair fingers. When Promise finally turned his head and looked at her, under his puzzled gaze, which carried a sense of foreboding, Athena adorably blinked at Promise and her mouth slowly curved into a smile. Wait, what are you planning now, wise goddess? Hera,